All right, next up we're going to talk about the menus, and as you can see here, there are a ton of them, around 180 from my last count. It's a lot. What I want you to do is put the mode dial onto the M position. All right, I want to give you a few tips to help navigate all 180 of these items. You can see these icons to the left of each one of these items. It has kind of a box with a mountain range inside of it. That's Sony's way of telling you that this is a stills only item. If we go up to tab 2 and we go down to these items that we see here, like file format and record setting, we can see they have a little movie strip next to them. And obviously these are movie related items only. All right, moving our way up to tab number 1. Tab number 1 is primarily stills related items. I would say there's some movie items in there, but they're trying to lump a lot of the stills items in tab number 1. Tab number 2 is primarily movie related items. Will you find stills items in there? Yes, you will, but they're trying to get better at their menus. And Sony's gotten a lot of flack for not having the greatest menus, and they're definitely trying, but they definitely have room for improvement as well. All right, moving on to the next tab, it says network. I would primarily call this like wireless transfer, controlling your smartphone, FTP, that kind of stuff. Next one, obviously, is playback. Last one with the toolbox is setup. I kind of call that your utilities, or places where you set things like once and you don't go back to it that often. And then the last one we've already talked about is my menu. And the last tip I'll give you is when you're in the menu and you run into a grayed out item like we do here and you try to select it, it says you can't do it. I'd say 90% of the time it has to do where you are on the mode dial. So right now I'm in M in the stills mode. What I'm going to do is move over to movie mode, hit the menu button. And you can see now I can select exposure mode and I can go ahead and change it. So if you're following along with me, on this first tab, number 1, we're going to be in the M stills mode on the mode dial. All right, so let's get started. The first one on page 1 of 14, tab number 1 is file format. You're going to be saying, well, Dave, this is stills related. It is. I just want to kind of glance over these items really quickly and just give you a quick recommendation. For instance, if you're creating a time lapse, you cannot do it in the camera like I've talked about before. You'll have to do it in your computer. And when you do it in your computer and you choose something like RAW, things are going to slow down a lot. The file sizes are a lot bigger. The workflow is a lot larger. So you just might want to think twice about using a RAW format versus JPEG when you're creating thousands of images that you're going to make a time lapse out of. Next up is compressed versus uncompressed in terms of the RAW files. Now, if you're shooting time lapses, I doubt you'll ever see a difference between the two. And I've run tests on this where I've looked at the forums and people said, yeah, if you shoot this type of photo just a certain way where you have a ton of backlit lighting just on the edge, you'll be able to see some minor artifacts or things that you don't want basically in the image. And I've run lots of tests on this, and I've used Lightroom, and I've like zoomed all the way into the 24 megapixels of this camera, and I can't see the difference. So if you're running, I would say, a time lapse to create into videos, I don't think you'd ever have to worry about this using the compressed format of the RAW, because you're going to get a lot smaller file size. It's going to be a lot easier to handle in post than doing uncompressed. All right, next up is JPEG quality. I normally set this to extra fine because I don't want that much compression. If you go down here to standard, there's a lot of compression, there's a little bit less compression, and then this is the one that has the least amount of compression. So when I'm doing a time lapse, I don't want a whole bunch of compression. If you want to limit the file size, you can go down here to where it says JPEG image size, and you can change this to be much lower than 10 meg. Now I have a crop lens on this body right now, so it's showing the largest size is 10 meg. Let's go ahead and switch that out. All right, now that we have full frame glass on the camera, we can actually see the maximum 24 megapixels. If you're shooting for a 4K time lapse, I would actually stay away from this bottom one to reduce the file size. This one will give you less than a 4K image. It gives you 3008 by 1692, and I'm giving these in 16:9 aspect ratio numbers, not the full 3:2 aspect ratio numbers. The next one is 10 meg. This will result in a 3936 by 2214. So this one is a little bit bigger than a 4K recording, which is good if you need a little bit room to pan and scan around the image. And then obviously the top one is 6,000 by 3,375. This will give you a lot of leeway if you need to pan and scan around the image, but it'll give you a larger file size. All right, next up is aspect ratio. If you're really confident, you can choose 16:9 if you know the exact framing that you want. But there's no reason not to choose 3:2. That'll give you a little headroom on the top. It'll give you some room on the bottom. So if you needed to, you could like tilt up and tilt down in the image to create a different effect if you wanted to. All right, next up is Aps-C Super 35. As you can see, we have a couple of different selections here. We're going to get to those here in a minute. I want to cover a few key concepts to maybe help clear up some confusion of what Aps-C and Super 35 is. Now, if you bought this camera versus something like the Sony A6500, which I would call a cropped camera, or Aps-C/Super 35, you kind of maybe already know the differences, but I want to just kind of visually show things, maybe help clarify what's going on here. So if we look at the red box here, this is the 35mm full frame sensor, but we're in video mode in more of a 16:9 aspect ratio. So when we shoot movies, we're not using the entire sensor. We're basically chopping off some of the top and some of the bottom. When we look at Aps-C 16:9, we can see it's gotten smaller. So basically we're using a lot less real estate on the sensor, but we're recording basically inside that same area, just cropped. We're basically cropped in on the image. And if we look at Super 35 movies, you can see that the blue box and what we see here on the film strip, they're both very similar. And that's why they say Aps-C/Super 35. I think for the remainder of this course, I'm just going to say crop instead of saying Aps-C/Super 35. Where I think some of the confusion comes is with the lenses. So let's take a look at a B&H page for this particular lens. This is a Sony 18-105. It's the Sony E 18-105. So really quickly, the E stands for 18, which is the distance between the flange on the camera to the sensor. So it's 18 millimeters, however long that is. And this lens, these type of lenses from the NEX lens lineup came out first. So they just sold it E for the E mount. And then later on, they're like, oh, I think we want to make full frame glass. So this lens, which is the 55mm that you can see here, is called an FE lens. So now we've got the F basically just stands for full frame. At least that's what I think it stands for. I've never asked them, but I'm pretty sure the F stands for full frame. Where the E is basically your crop lens. So think of them this way. When you see it where it just says E, that's your crop lens. Where it says FE, that's your full frame glass. Next, I want to discuss whether you should shoot in full frame or crop mode, because both of them have their advantages and disadvantages. We're going to run through 3 different categories: noise, artifacts like Moire and Aliasing, and also rolling shutter. All right, the first test we're going to do is the noise test. Before I get started, let me show you something from a different line of cameras. This is from the Sony A7iii. The crop is on the left, full frame is on the right, and I'm swiping, and you can see the right side has a lot more noise than the left side, meaning the A7iii, there was a massive difference between the crop mode and the full frame mode, and it kind of pigeonholed you, it forced you to shoot in crop mode on that camera. This camera is a lot different. The A7 III is wonderful. You can shoot in crop and full frame mode. In terms of the noise difference, there's very little, as we're going to see here in a second. So what I'm going to do for these tests is we're going to start the ramp at 3200 ISO. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and we're going to go from HD, and we're going to move this to 4K. And in this test, what we're going to do is go back and forth between full frame mode and crop mode. All right, starting out at 3200, we have full frame on the left, crop on the right. We're going to be concentrating on the blue channel because that's usually where most of that noise is going to be present. We zoom in and we look at both. They're pretty close, but I would say the winner here is full frame. And it's not as big of a difference as that previous camera. 6400, we go ahead and zoom in. Again, the winner is on the left, full frame, but not by much, just a little bit. Moving on to 12,800. Again, same story. We got full frame on the left is a slight winner. Moving to 32,000, when we zoom in, yeah, we can see that it's definitely a winner here is full frame. And just for last, I went all the way up to 100,000, and the winner is full frame. Now you might be seeing something a little bit different, because when I upload this to Vimeo and they retranscode it, basically, it might suppress or give the noise a little bit different characteristic, but I'm just showing or telling you what I can see on the monitor before it's uploaded to Vimeo. In this next test, I wanted to see what the difference was between full frame 1080 and crop 1080. This is at 12,800. And when we zoom in, it sure looks like the winner here is full frame at 1080. All right, in this next test, since full frame won both on 4K and 1080, I want to see the difference between full frame 4K and full frame HD. So let's take a look at the difference. Full frame 4K on the left, full frame 1080 on the right, 12,800. And when we zoom in, it sure looks like the winner here is 4K. It might be just because we're downsampling 4K onto a 1080 timeline and it's making it look cleaner. Before we move on, let's give a few noise conclusions. First one is use full frame over crop at high ISOs, like above 3200. But really, as we've shown here, there's not that big of a difference between crop and full frame in terms of noise. They're pretty close. But if you want still slightly cleaner signal, use full frame. The second one is if you want slightly less noise, shoot in 4K rather than 1080. All right, in the next test, we're going to talk about aliasing and moire. Actually, Sony doesn't call it aliasing, they call them the jaggies. That's basically what you're going to get artifacts when shooting with these stills cameras, sometimes when you have too many megapixels and you're trying to cram it into a video file. Before we get started, let's go ahead and explain how video is created from these type of sensors. All right, what we have in this red box here is a 4K signal, and that's 38 by 40 pixels wide by 2160 pixels tall. When we're shooting a crop mode, 16 by 9 aspect ratio, we have 3936 by 2214 pixels tall. So it's a full pixel readout. We're doing some slight oversampling. It's basically going from 4K to 4K. So as we see here, we have 3936 is not that much more than 3840, which is the 4K signal. And then we've got 2214 is being downsampled or oversampled down to 2160. Now, oversampling can increase detail, but you can get some slight artifacts. But for the most part, it's pretty much artifact free in the crop mode. Moving on to full frame mode, again 16 by 9, and we're at a 20 megapixel image size. We have 6000 now is being crammed down into 3840, and then on the tall side, we're going 3375 down to 2160. So basically we're oversampling. We're not pixel binning. We're not throwing out any of that information or pixels that usually create artifacts and moire patterns and stuff like that, which is great on this camera. So you should be able to shoot in crop mode and full frame and still get a great looking signal. So before on previous Sony cameras, you really had to worry about shooting in crop mode or full frame mode. But on this camera, you really don't need to worry about it when it comes to the jaggies or moire patterns that might develop. You can shoot neither one and you're going to be pretty much artifact free. So demonstrating this aliasing and moire is a little bit complicated. The first thing I want to say is you need to really watch this natively at 1080. So if you're watching this on an iPhone, it's not going to work. I might be seeing no aliasing, but you might be seeing it on your iPhone because the iPhone is taking that 1080 signal and bringing it down. If you're watching this, let's say on a 5K iMac display or something like that, make sure you watch it in a 1080 window of your monitor. Don't make it full frame because then you're going to see different things as well. Over the years, I've shot a lot of business suits because when you interviewed CEOs and charts and rooftops with shingles and power lines looking for jaggies and more architecture and even more charts. But really when it comes down to it, one of the things I've found that shows these type of artifacts really well is this lens right here and these vertical lines that we have here. And it needs to be on that focus plane so you can see as much detail as possible. So that's what you're going to be looking out for. I'm going to have a few other things like charts in here, but where you would normally see it is right here on the focus barrel and the zoom barrel on this particular lens. So keep an eye out for that. But on these tests, what's great about this camera is you're probably not going to see much at all. Where other Sony cameras like the A7iii that I'm filming with in full frame mode, you would see some artifacts, but hopefully we won't see any in these tests. All right, we have 4K full frame on the left, 4K crop on the right. Obviously the crop's gonna look a little bit closer in. This is at a 6-foot distance, and distance usually matters a lot. And keeping an eye on that lens, where the barrel is, we have those vertical lines. I'd say they're both good. They look pretty good. And what I'm gonna do is go ahead and zoom in 2x to simulate a 4K timeline, what would be on a 4K timeline, because this is shot in 4K. and both of them look really good again. I'm moving these images around a little bit in terms of I'm just shaking the tripod just to kind of see if any of those Moire patterns develop. Now what we've done, we've moved in from 6 feet to 4 feet. We've moved in a couple of feet closer, and I would say this is even better. Sometimes you can get different interference patterns like on the business suit or some of the charts, but here they both look pretty darn good. All right, next up we're gonna move to 1080. So we're gonna shoot camera on 1080, put on a 1080 timeline, and again, what I want you to look for is right here on the lens, and you are gonna start to see some Moire patterns start to develop. So let's take a look. So on the left-hand side, we got 1080 full frame, crop on the right at 1080, and I would say both are looking pretty bad. You can kind of see those patterns developing on both of them. And then we're gonna move into a 4-foot distance. And then we're going to see something a little bit different here. We're going to see that the crop mode looks pretty bad, but the full frame on the left side actually looks a little bit better here. So we definitely can get some artifacts developing like on this lens. So distance really matters. So when you're shooting at 1080, you want to be conscious of where you're at in terms of when you're shooting something with some really fine detail. So what happens when we shoot for slow motion? Full frame 1080, 60p on the left, 120p on the right. At a 4-foot distance, they both look actually not too bad because they can't resolve the detail at this distance. They're about the same, I would say, at this distance. But we move to a 4-foot distance and we can see the detail on the lens a little bit better. We can see that they're both pretty bad. They're both creating these kind of Moire patterns on the lens. All right, the next test we're going to do is rolling shutter. Some people might call it jello, because if you have a plate of jello, let's say it's on the plate, and if you were to tap the plate, the jello would move back and forth like this. And that's the same thing that's happening with our cameras, is the readout starts at the bottom and then goes really fast up to the top and then starts at the bottom and goes up to the top again. And what happens is by the time it gets to the top and there's really a lot of fast motion, you're going to get this kind of jello effect happening in the frame. So let's go ahead and take a look. What I've got here is a gimbal that I can press 3 times to go into selfie mode, and it whips around really fast. And what's great about this is I can repeat it each time and have the same amount of speed going past that silver pole. And so we're going to take a look. This is a 1080 crop and it's whipped around. It's not too bad. Looks pretty good. Next one's 4K crop. Looks a lot worse. There's a lot more rolling shutter there. There's 1080 full frame. Not too bad. And 4K full frame, which looks pretty bad. So let's go ahead and compare. So we got 4K on the left sliding over to 1080, and as you can see in full frame, 4K is a lot worse than 1080 in terms of rolling shutter. All right, the next one we're just going to look at 4K, full frame on the left, crop on the right, and as we put them together, we can see full frame is just a little bit worse than crop when we're shooting in 4K. All right, some final conclusions. Number 1, use full frame at high ISOs for noise. Crop and full frame are not that different, but if you want just a little bit cleaner signal, use full frame. Number 2, use crop at 1080 for fast action. When you have a scene like you're mounting a camera on a car or action scene where there's a lot of things happening, putting it in crop 1080 will give you the least amount of rolling shutter or that jello effect. Number 3, use full frame or crop at 4K. Basically, both of them don't have any artifacts, which is one of the best things about this camera. Number 4, when you're shooting at 1080, there are artifacts. So use full frame, it might have a little bit less. Distance really matters here. You want to look through the EVF and find out if you can see that type of Moire pattern developing when you're shooting in 1080, and just kind of moved in or out, and maybe have to reframe a little bit to eliminate some of those Moire patterns when you're shooting at 1080. Number 5, use full frame for slow motion, 60p or 120p. That might be a little bit cleaner than shooting in crop. All right, moving back to the menu, we have 2 options. This top option is auto or manual. So basically, if I take this is a crop lens now, it's an 18-105, and I put on a full frame body. If I set this to auto, that means it's gonna say, the camera's gonna say, yeah, I know what lens that is. It's a crop lens. I'm gonna put myself into crop mode. Everything's good. And if we go out of here, you can see, yep, sure enough, it fills the entire frame basically. So if I go out of here and I go this to put this to manual, and then I go back out, you can see, oh, especially if I zoom in a little bit, you can see it's basically a circle. So basically it's the whole readout of the entire full frame is happening, but yet the coverage of the lens is only doing a small amount in the center. So if you use crop lenses a lot, I would typically put this to auto and just let it do its thing. But if you use a lot of full frame glass, You may not, you could just leave this on manual. And basically what this is, this next one, you can either have it on or off. Basically this means on means you're in Super 35 and off means you're in full frame. And we've already assigned this to the C3 button. So let me demonstrate. I'm going to leave this off right now, and I'm going to leave this on manual so it's not automatically doing it. So off, and we go out, and sure enough we see a circle. Now if I hit the C3 button and then I go back into the menu, watch what happened to that. It's not off anymore, it's turned on. So basically this is just an override, and it acts exactly how we've mapped the C3 button. All right, long exposure noise reduction. I would definitely turn this off if you shoot JPEG and you're doing a time lapse of like night photography of like stars going by, for instance. Let's say you're leaving the shutter open for 10 seconds at ISO 6400 and you want to get this nice fluid motion of the stars going across the sky at night. Well, if you leave this on, basically what happens is since you left the shutter open for 15 seconds, it's going to take 15 seconds for that image to process to be written to the card. And what's basically going to happen is, like, if you take one of those stars, it's going to go from one part of the sky and it's going to move slightly. And so what you're going to have is this kind of a choppy playback of the stars going by. What you basically want to have happen is the shutter be open for 15 seconds. When it closes, writes to the card, boom, it opens immediately after, milliseconds later, really quickly, basically. And you get this nice fluid motion. So what you're going to basically be doing is not doing noise reduction in the camera. You'll do it in something like Lightroom later on. High ISO noise reduction. This is stills related, only for JPEGs, has nothing to do with video. So we're going to go ahead and skip that one. Color space. We can't increase the color space by going to AdobeRGB. This is only stills related. Later on in the picture profiles, we'll talk about Gamut and BT 2020. All right, next up is lens compensation. You've got shading, which is basically vignetting. Chromatic aberration is basically like kind of, you see that purple fringing like you see in there in this example. This one's pretty extreme, just so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. It'll correct for all that purple fringing. And the last one is distortion compensation, so like barrel distortion. It's grayed out on this lens. My theory is it's grayed out because it's so bad on this lens. I mean, it's so exaggerated. So let me show you an example of this. So this is the 18-105 with all the correction turned on. And as you can see, all the lines of the walls and everything are extremely straight. But when we go to the FS5, where I was able to turn it off, the barrel distortion correction, you can see that, wow, the walls are, you can see the curvature that they have on them, especially kind of in the mid-range of this part of the zoom. As we pull out, it gets a little bit better. But as we go in, you can see just how much, especially in that door frame, you can see how much bowing is happening inside the glass. So I would consider this 18-105 to be more of like a software lens, meaning that if you don't use the software, like this distortion compensation, it says this function is currently disabled. The reason is we don't want to show you just how bad it is. For some reason on the FS5 Sony camera, you could turn this off, but you can't do it here. So my thought process on this is I would much rather have the lens and the camera do all of this on the fly for me, from the vignetting, so it's correcting the darker edges around the edge of the frame. It's getting rid of chromatic aberration, which, I mean, you could do in DaVinci Resolve if you had create a selection for like purple and you were to maybe bring down the intensity of that color, or you might screw up other colors. It's just so much easier for it to do it in camera. And the last one, distortion compensation. If you ever had a GoPro and you've had the software correct for that barrel distortion, you'll understand how much power it takes to correct that with your CPU, and you won't be able to play things back in real time and it becomes a nightmare. Just let the camera do it all itself, and it does a great job at it. All right, page 3 of 14, at the very top we have scene selection. If you don't see it, I mean meaning it's grayed out, and you want to be able to play with it, go ahead and move your mode dial over to scene and you'll be able to select it. And basically what's going to happen here is when we're in scene mode, it pretty much takes control over the entire camera. ISO, shutter speed, just about everything. White balance, you can't change anything. It's doing everything for you automatically based off of what you think the scene should be. So for instance, portrait, sports, macro, landscape, sunset, night scene, and night portrait. So let's go back to portrait. I'm going to go ahead and select that. And as we have the doll here in portrait mode, you'll notice I can't change anything. I'm changing all the back dials right now. Nothing is changing. In fact, I try to change the white balance. It says, hey, you can't do it in portrait mode. But if you use the front dial, we can cycle through them. So this is portrait. This looks like sports. And we've got macro, landscape. As you can see, it probably changed the creative style to landscape as her skin got a lot more orangey. I forget what this one is, sunset maybe? Night, and I think this is night portrait and back to portrait. All right, I've moved the mode dial back to M and we're gonna continue on. Drive mode. If I go ahead and select this, you can see we have a bunch of different things, and this is strictly photography. Really has nothing to do with creating a video, even from a time-lapse, because I don't know why you'd ever want to do high continuous shooting in a time-lapse mode. Moving our way down, we have bracket settings, so you can actually change this if you want, and I guess you could shoot an HDR time-lapse, but boy, that would be a ton of work if you did it that way. All right, moving on, we have recall and we have memory. I'm gonna actually start with memory, and I'm on the movie mode on the mode dial. So let's start with memory. As you can see, I have a 1 and a 2, and these are physical numbers actually on the mode dial, and I'd call these physical memories that you can basically set and recall. The M1 through M4, I would call those software memories. They're kind of hard to remember because you have to go into the menu to retrieve them, and I just don't use them. It's just an extra level of complexity. So if I ever use it, I'm just going to use 1 and 2. And I usually use just 2 because if you look at the mode dial, 2 is right next to movie, and it's really easy to switch between movie mode and number 2. So what I'm going to do is demonstrate how easy this is to go from like shooting normal speed motion to slow motion. So as you can see here, I'm shooting at Xavc HD 24p, and I've got the shutter speed set to a 50th of a second. If I take this on the mode dial from movie to number 2, you'll see that now the shutter speed changed to 125th of a second, and we can see that our frame rate went from 24 up to 60p, so allowing us to get to slow motion really quickly. So how do you set this? You go to memory and pick the memory that you want to store it in, make all the changes that you want. Let's say, and you want to store it to number 2. On the jog wheel, the center button, just press it and it says it's registered. All right, so you might be thinking that's a great idea. I'll just go from movie mode to number 2 to go to slow motion really quickly, and it'll just save you a lot of time. Maybe. Let me give you an example of what happened to me when I was shooting a volleyball game recently. So I'm shooting away, I've got the camera set all up for shooting for 4K, white balance, DRO, ISO, f-stop number, everything's dialed in and everything's great. And then I'm thinking, oh wait, I'll just go to number 2 for slow motion. So I flip it on over and I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, the Kelvin's way off. It's at, instead of being in where I had it before, now it's at 6500 from the time before that I set the memory. So that's not the best way to do it. So the better way to do it when you're like shooting an example like that volleyball game is go ahead, get your camera totally set up for like 4K. Everything's dialed in, and then when you're ready to shoot slow motion and after you got your DRO, your white balance, your f-stop number, all that stuff is set up the way you want it, go ahead and store a new memory with the new shutter speed and the new frame rate, and then you'll be able to go from movie mode to number 2 quite quickly, and all those other things will be changed. So don't go into thinking, oh, I had saved it from weeks ago and I'm just going to go do it again. You actually have to do it in that moment of that day to recall it. All right, moving our way down, we have select media. You might be thinking, oh, this is where I choose which slot to record to the card. No, it has nothing to do with that. The MR before it actually means memory. So this is where you would take these 4 software memories I talked about, M1 through M4, and you can either register or recall them to slot 1 or slot 2. Again, this is something I don't really use, those actual memories, because they're even more confusing than the stuff that's on the mode dial. Again, use them with caution because it can really trip you up and change a whole bunch of settings you didn't think you were changing. All right, we're on page 4. There's only one item, and this one's registered custom settings to custom key. It's basically what it says in the manual and what I'm reading here. This is stills only. This is brand new to this camera. It's kind of a neat concept. I could see maybe in the future them using it for video. It would be kind of cool. But basically what you've got here is you can set up a custom button, kind of a hold button basically. Let's say if we choose number 1 for instance, basically set up the only thing that you want to change basically. And so you could just hold down a button and it would change the camera into a different mode. I don't know if they could do this for like slow motion, but that would be kind of cool, that you would like, instead of using the mode dial, you just press and hold the custom button and then you're shooting in slow motion, let's say, and then you release it and then you're shooting 4K video or something like that. That would be kind of cool, but this is stills only, so we're just gonna keep moving on. All right, moving on to page 5. Just a quick note, I am back on the M on the mode dial. So if we go into focus mode, we've got a lot of different choices in stills, but really, like I talked about before, we only have 2, kind of 3, and I'm gonna have a whole section on the pros and cons of shooting in a stills mode versus shooting in movie mode. Like direct manual focus, we're gonna talk about that later. But this is where you basically change your different focus modes. All right, moving our way down, we have 2 priority sets. I'm gonna totally skip these, totally stills related. Focus area, let's start at the top. We have wide. That pretty much covers the entire frame in terms of autofocus. Moving down to zone, I can't touch the screen and make this work when I have the HDMI connector, but there's another way we can actually move this around, and that's with the multi-selector, not the jog wheel, but the one above it. And I can move this around the screen like this. A lot of different reasons you might want to do this. For instance, let's say if somebody that you're interviewing is over in this quadrant, their head, basically, and you just want to narrow in on that and disregard anything else that's happening in the frame. Maybe people are walking up and down a hallway on the right side of the frame, and you don't want that confusing your autofocus, and you just want it to stay on that person's face and area. This was a great way to use it. All right, moving our way down, we've got center, and basically all this does, if I press the shutter halfway down, you'll see it turn green, and it just basically is just in the center. You can't move this one around at all. So I don't really use that one that much. Moving our way down, we have 3 different flexible spots. There is a large, a small, and a medium. Let's start off with small, and you can see how small it is. And then if we go to large, you can see how large this is. This one you can move around with your finger on the screen. Again, I can't do it because the HDMI connector is plugged in, but I'm going to just kind of move it around this way. This, again, if you have, let's say, somebody you're interviewing, and you just want their head basically, and you want to make a very small area, you can definitely use this. This is actually a great place to slow down just for a second. I want to show you some material. You might be thinking, well, what's better? Should I use my finger on the screen or use the multi-selector to move the box around when I want to refocus on something? Let's say you're going between one item and another. Now, if I was on a tripod, you could probably pretty much get away with both of them. Use your finger on the screen or use both if it's locked down really well. You won't see any movement. But when you're doing it handheld, this is the question I had, which would be better? You're using your thumb on the screen the way you have assigned, like it's up against your face and you're moving your thumb around on the screen to move the focus point, or using multi-select. Let me show you an example here. I was just screwing around in volleyball, just taking a break. So right here, I'm focused on the tripod using my finger, and now I'm moving my finger over to the cart, and I'm moving it back to like where the girl is, and then moving it back to the cart. And now moving to the girls that are walking in, and back to the cart. So this is all being done with my thumb. Now I'm going to do it with the multi-selector switch. Got the girls, and now you see how the camera's moving back and forth like that? Now I'm at the cart. Now watch what happens when I go back to the girl serving. And now I'll go back to the cart. You see each time I do it, it's like boom, 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 boom. So basically what you're seeing there is me hitting that multi-selector switch one direction. It moves the camera quite a bit when you're handheld, especially with like the 70 to 200 that I was using. So in that case, I would say using the touchscreen is a lot smoother in terms of refocusing something. So moving our way down, we have what's called expanded flexible spot. Let me show you what that looks like. So you can see there's a box within a box. So you have a very small box in the middle, and then you've got a little bit bigger box outside of it. And basically it says, hey, I'm going to take priority of everything that's inside that very small box. But if something should happen a little bit outside that, you know, where the dash line is around it, I'll take that as well, kind of as a secondary. To be honest, I don't use it that often. The one that I use the most in terms of like doing stuff like that with the touch screen is the one before it, this one right here. And then I can choose the different size that I want. A lot of times, to be honest, I'm using large and with my finger, and that gives me a great way to refocus things on the screen. All right, moving our way down to focus settings. So once you've got your zone configured, let's say, and you come down here and you want to move that box around, I don't know why you'd ever want to do this way, but now we've assigned it to the front dial, so we can move it up and down, and the rear dial moves it left and right. I don't know why you'd ever want to do this now that we have a touchscreen, because the touchscreen's so easy. And by using the dial, you're basically shaking the camera around quite a bit instead of a nice delicate touch with like your thumb moving around on the screen. I don't know why you'd ever use it this way. And if you wanted to, where it says trash can, you hit the trash can and it puts that box right back in the center. All right, moving our way down, we have this vertical and horizontal autofocus area. This is stills related, so when you turn the camera, when are you gonna ever turn the camera vertically to shoot a video? You're always gonna be shooting it horizontally, aren't you? So we're definitely gonna skip that one. That's stills only. Autofocus Illuminator, I've already talked about this in the previous video, so we're gonna pretty much skip this. All I'm gonna say here is you can turn it off if you wanted to, if it's very annoying and you're in stills mode. I just wanna repeat, you can't use this in movie mode. All right, next up is center lock-on autofocus. We've already demonstrated this already. What I want to do is kind of show you some footage, and then I'm going to actually try it right here in my office as well. So let's take a look at some footage first. So here you can see I'm locking on to a volleyball player with a white jersey. I was kind of interested to see if it tracks just that one player, but as you can see it tracks multiple players, but it's actually not tracking the other jerseys, the different color. You can see it's kind of staying away from it. And when they step out of the frame, it's looking for something with like a white jersey. So you can see it's trying different things on this one. Here I'm tracking again, trying to track that particular person, and you can see it just gets all sorts of confused. So it just doesn't really work all that well for really fast moving objects like volleyball players, let alone like trying to track a volleyball and tracking the volleyball. It's just not fast enough. All right, you can see I have a double white box around me, which means that we have center lock on. So I've locked on me as an object. And I would say it's definitely not as fast responding as something like the face detection. The face detection works fantastic on this camera. This one, I don't know if it's an older algorithm or what, or the processor, it doesn't track as fast as the face detection does. All right, to compare center lock on, we're going to go to Set, Face, Priority, and Autofocus. And basically what this does is puts a box around the face. I'll demonstrate that here in a second. You can just basically turn this on or off, and basically what it's going to do is give priority to faces. It might already be focusing on the nearest object, which might be somebody's face, but this one is tenacious. It'll find any face you've got in there, and it'll track up to like 8 of them. Remember, I've signed this to a custom button, and so I can turn this off quickly if I need to, because sometimes it'll be focusing on the wrong face, and I'm just like, I just need to turn this off, and then I'll focus on the nearest object. So going back into the menu, the next one down is Face Detect Frame Display. Basically, it's showing you the box around the person's face, and it has different colors, and we're going to get more into that later, but you can turn this off if you want to. I like to leave it on because I want to know which face it's focusing on. So let's go ahead and demonstrate this now. All right, compared to center lock on, which just tracks objects, we've got face detection, so we have priority on the face. And as you can see, this white box that's tracking my face is tenacious. It won't let go, which is fantastic. Over the past 4 years, Sony has really evolved and changed their algorithm in terms of how this works. So one of the first tests we're gonna do, especially if you're thinking ever about doing an interview where you're gonna use continuous autofocus and you're shooting at, let's say, around f1.8 or even at 2.5 like we are here, and the person moves around quite a bit, and you really want to shallow depth of field because maybe the background is really boring and you don't like it, you can use this. I've used this in several interviews and it's actually worked surprisingly well. So the first test we're going to do to kind of explain how this algorithm works is I'm going to put glasses on, because a lot of time people will actually wear regular glasses in an interview, not sunglasses, because I don't have any regular glasses. But they could touch their glasses a lot of times in an interview. They might adjust them or something like that, or to make a point, or they might. And as you can see, the box around my face is just tenacious. It won't let go. Whereas previous Sony cameras, it would have let go. And then what would have happened is, you see that white light switch behind me? That light switch is in the center of the frame, and it would have latched onto that. It has a little bit of contrast, and it would have taken over. So let me go ahead and demonstrate that. So if I start moving my face out of the frame, all the way out, you could see, boom, it just locked on to the light switch. And when I come back, it quickly grabs my face. So the way this algorithm's set up in this camera and how it's changed a little bit is kind of like right here in the center of the frame, it places a extreme high priority, whatever's in here. Even if it's like really dark and there's hardly any contrast on the item, it's still gonna lock on to that when you're in autofocus continuous. And what's happened over the last 4 years is they've kind of expanded it and made it a little bit bigger. Perhaps it's maybe about this big right now. So anything that's inside of here, this area right here, it's gonna latch onto quite quickly. So if I just take my, well, actually it's focused on my hand, but you can see that my hand, and then I put it away, it's gonna go to the light switch right there. Even though if I bring up my hand to about right here, you can see it's not grabbing my hand yet. And then at some point, boom, it grabs my hand. So the next thing might happen in an interview, if you ever decide to do this and you're putting somebody like on the rule of thirds like I am, is they might rub their nose, you know, they might do kind of like this, maybe they have a cold or something like that. And if you get, what it's looking for is two eyes, kind of a line here and a line here. This is what I think the algorithm's looking for. And sometimes if you cover up your mouth and nose, it'll lose the box, and then it would focus on the light switch, is something you didn't want. But as you can see here, it's gotten so good, it's really hard for me to lose the face detection. There, I lost it. All right, the A7iii and this camera came out within a few months of each other. So I believe the algorithm is exactly the same. From all the tests that I've run here in my office, they seem to be about the same. And the A7iii, I ran about, I did about 10 different interviews using this method like right here, where people are like on the rule of thirds, and it could have gone to the background if it screwed up. It's kind of a gutsy move, but it was the type of interviews where like, hey, I was watching the monitor, I was like, hey, I think you could do better, can we try it again? And I'd say out of those 10 interviews, it worked pretty much flawlessly, except for one item, one time, and I'll show it to you here, is where this woman was talking with her hands, and then it just lost it on her face for some reason. But as you can see here, I mean, I'm trying to screw up the autofocus, and it's really hard if I were to talk with my hands, and it's really, I mean, it's tracking my face and it's not losing it all, which is just fantastic. All right, next one is autofocus track sensitivity. All I'll say here is don't get this confused with the other two that are meant for movies. This one is just changing the track sensitivity of your autofocus for stills only. All right, next one is AF system. It's grayed out. This is stills only, so we're just going to go ahead and skip it, but it basically deals with 8-mount lenses. AF with shutter. This is photography only. If you have it on, basically when you press the shutter halfway down, it'll lock on, and then when you turn it off, you press the shutter halfway down, it won't try to acquire focus basically. In terms of movies, I've tried it. Even when you turn it off, it will still acquire focus when you press the shutter halfway down. All right, now we're on page 7. It's got pre-autofocus. This is stills related only. Going to skip it. This is only for stills, only for stills, only for stills. And then we get to this one, autofocus area auto clear. So let me demonstrate what this is. You see it doesn't have an icon next to it saying, hey, it's a stills related item. So we'll test this out really quick. I'm in M as in manual mode, not movie mode on the dial. And I'm in autofocus single. And I press the shutter halfway down. And I'm still holding the shutter halfway down with my finger. You can see all those green points are still there. Now if I go into the menu here and I turn this on, watch what happens. It's still holding, and about a half second later, it disappears. Even though I'm still holding it, the green items disappear. So if we go into the movie mode and we press the shutter halfway down, you can see those green items are appearing, and I'm still holding the shutter and they're still there, and they're still there. So let's go ahead and change it to the other selection just to make sure nothing else is going on. Press the shutter halfway down, still there, still there, still there. It hasn't gone away after half a second. So you know, this is where Sony could still work on their menus. There's no way this could be a movie-related item. I'm in movie mode and it's not clearing things out. So this should have a icon next to it if you ask me. All right, moving our way down, we have display continuous autofocus area. It doesn't have an icon next to it again. saying it's stills related, but I'm pretty sure it is. So let me demonstrate really quickly. So if this is turned on and I'm in a stills mode, like M, and I press the shutter halfway down, you can see those dancing green dots. It tells you what's being focused upon, which is great. If I go back in, I turn this off, press the shutter halfway down, they're all gone. So if I go back, turn this on, and I go to movie mode, press the shutter halfway down, I see the green squares, but I can go in and turn this off, and I still see the green squares. So this is totally not a movie item, so I'm not sure why there's not an icon there for stills only. AF micro adjust. I don't have any A mount lenses with certain adapters from Sony or old Minolta lenses to really demonstrate this for you, but basically from my understanding is you can actually go in and micro adjust each individual A mount lens if it's a little bit out of whack for autofocusing. All right, at the top of page 9, we have exposure compensation. I'm going to hit the menu button again to get out of there, and so we can see the screen. And I'm basically going to do is take the exposure compensation dial. I'm going to go from 0 to +2, and I'm going to go from +2 to +3. And you can see there was no difference when I went from 2 to 3. And I go down to a -2 and go to -3, you see no difference. But as I move it in the +2 to -2 range, you can see it's actually working. In order to make this work, you have to have ISO on auto, and you can change your exposure this way, but man, I really don't recommend it because it's such a clunky way of doing it with only a +2 to -2 exposure range. Next up, we have exposure EV comp. So basically you can have the camera reset the value of where you were in terms of compensation because it's a physical dial. So if I rotate this to +1, I turn the camera off, turn it back on again. If you have set this to reset, it's going to go back down to 0. If you set this to maintain, it's always going to respect what's on the physical dial. All right, next up is ISO, or I might call it ISO. Think of it this way. ISO is like this amplifier that's driving these speakers. If I'm not playing any music and I have the volume turned all the way down and I put my ear all the way up to the speaker, it's going to be pretty much dead silent. If I go and turn my amplifier all the way up, or put my head right up to, or ear right up to the speaker, it's going to sound like a shh, it's going to get noisier. Well, that's a great analogy of what's happening here in the camera. As we turn up the gain, we turn up the amplification, we turn up the ISO, it's going to get, 1, brighter, and 2, it's also going to get noisier. When we select this item, we get a lot of different ISO numbers. 100 is basically the lowest you can go when you're shooting video. You can't go down here, unfortunately, to 50. You've got auto, so it does it automatically. And if you cursor to the right on auto, you could actually take you could set the min and the max. So I could set this higher if I want to, or I could take the maximum, which is what I usually do, and I bring this down to something where I'm more comfortable. I'm basically saying, hey, here's a range. I don't mind if you go within this range, but like don't go even higher than that. I want you to go to like from 100 to 3200. So going from the outside, I'm going to go basically into the car, and it's going from like 100 ISO, and here it is ramping all the way up to 3200 ISO. And as you can see, it does a really nice smooth job in terms of going from like outside to inside. So if you're in a situation where you want to set this up to be a certain range and you know you're going to be going from like outside to inside and you want it to ramp up nice and smoothly because you can't control the camera, maybe it's on a gimbal or something like that, like in this example, using auto ISO and setting the range sometimes can work quite well. ISO auto minimum shutter speed. You can see it's grayed out. I'm in movie mode right now. If I try to select it, it says I can't because I'm in manual exposure mode. For movie mode, I've tried program, aperture priority, shutter priority, and none of them work. So you can't use this when you're shooting videos. All right, next up is metering mode. We've got actually quite a few extras here from before. They added a few from the previous camera. So starting at the top is multi. And I'm going to go ahead and select that one. And what I want you to do is look down towards the bottom middle. You'll see a M.M. I think this stands for metering manual. And you see the ±0.0. So right now, the way this particular metering mode, it's saying with that light meter, you're got an even exposure. So if I change, let's say, the f-stop number, you're going to see the metering, the MM number change. See, it's getting darker, saying, oh, you're a stop under of what we think you should have for that. Let's go ahead and go into another metering mode. Let's go to spot, and we'll pick standard. Now spot, you can actually kind of see it. You see that circle? It's actually almost the same size as that white circle right there. Now when we look at the MM number, the metering, light meter basically in the camera, it says we're 2 stops under. So if we were just to concentrate on exposing the gray card correctly, let's go ahead and bring this up 2 stops. And now you can see the camera saying, hey, you got a properly exposed image using the spot meter. Let's go ahead and take a look at another one. The standard spot, and we also have large spot. So let's go ahead and take a look at the difference here. And you can see the circle got a lot bigger. And as we could see, the metering light meter in the camera is still at 0.0, saying, hey, you're good. But if I were to move the camera, let's say over here, a little bit into the light, now you can see we're +2 overexposed. All right, let's start with multi at the top. I can read off to you what it says in the manual. It's probably going to be more confusing, but I'll go ahead and read it anyway. Measures light on each area after dividing the total area into multiple areas and determines the proper exposure of the entire screen. Yeah, that's confusing. Basically what I'll tell you here is I actually leave it on multi most of the time. It does a really good job. The way to think about it is just pick one, basically. Either it's this one or maybe like entire average screen. Pick one of these two basically and just live with it and understand what it does. If you're one of those type of people that look at that MM number on the bottom, like right now it says I'm a 1.7 stops overexposed when it looks at like that entire frame. So let's go ahead and look at some more. This one's called center. I'm going to guess that it's pretty much looking at the center frame. We can see it's properly exposed, just like we did with the spot metering. Let's go take a look at another one. The spot we've already done. Here's the entire screen. So I'm going to guess it's going to be very similar. It's a little bit different. It's 1.3 stops over, where the other one was 1.7 stops over. So you can kind of get an idea of what it's looking at in the frame. I mean, I can read it to entire screen average. Measures the average brightness of the entire screen. The exposure will be stable even if the composition or the position of the subject changes. And the last one we're going to talk about is highlight. Let's go ahead and select it and see what it does. And as you can see, it's way overexposed. Let me read it to you. This one kind of makes sense. Measures the brightness while emphasizing the highlighted area on the screen. This mode is suitable for shooting the subject while avoiding overexposure. So the way I see this is it's kind of looking at the brightest part of the screen, like, you know, because there's actually snow in the background behind those blinds, and it's really overpowering. It's basically kind of like zebras. If I were to pick one or two, I would probably pick either this one or multi and just stick with it and understand what it does, and just don't go back and forth because it'll probably confuse you. And the situations like where you just want to expose a gray card, then I would go to either center, or I would go to the spot, like large in this case, and then you could line it up and then you can say, oh, I got properly exposed image. All right, next up is face priority in Multimeter. The best way to describe this is to show it to you. So what I do is turn this on. So basically when it detects a face, it's going to adjust the exposure when you're in Multimeter, that first metering mode that we talked about already. And you see the light meter, it says 0.0. It's saying, hey, this is properly exposed. And in Lightroom, what I did is I brought this face down a stop. As you can see, it's pretty close. It's a -0.7, like 2/3 of a stop lower. So it's looking at the light value, or the light meter value, inside the square of the detected face. So now the big question is, can you use this in movie mode? So I'm going to go ahead and press record. Remember, this is 0.7, or there it is, a -1. And this one is properly exposed. So I'm going to hit record. And as you can see, these are identical. So I've got this turned on, but when I get the framing lined up just perfectly, they're both exactly the same. So unfortunately, this particular feature does not work in movie mode. All right, next up on page 10 is spot metering point. There's center and focus point link. Let's start with center and I'll demonstrate it and I'll show you kind of what it does. I'm gonna actually move the expanded flexible spot kind of out of the way here a little bit so you can see this. You see the black circle? It's kind of lining up with the white circle. And you can see our light meter is saying 0.0. It's basically I'm in spot metering mode and I'm on auto ISO to make this work right here. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna move this camera, I'm gonna reframe basically over to that light area. You can see that it's changed the exposure on me. I'm gonna move it back. There we go. Let me move this so it doesn't keep breathing. Yeah, let me put it right there. Okay. So what I'm gonna do is change this to focus point link. So I'm basically linking the focus point with the spot metering. So now when we go in, I'm gonna move this up to the center. And you can see our light meter says we're at 0.0. And if I move it over to the side, sure enough, it not only focuses, but it adjusts the exposure. So where would you use this? Obviously, if you're using the multi-selector like I am, that's kind of cumbersome. But you can, remember, use your finger on the touchscreen and slide it back and forth. The only real example I could think of doing, I've never done this, but here's an example. I've seen this many times where you've got a frame shot. The person is locked off the tripod, so we're not reframing by moving the camera. We're basically just locking the shot off, and you've got a presenter behind a podium. And a lot of times what you'll see is them doing a PowerPoint, and the screen will be right next to them. And they just can't help themselves. They always leave the podium, they go to the screen, and they point to something. Well, you want to track focus of the person, but you also want to change the exposure. So what you could do is you link the two, like we have here, and then you would just use your finger. If you were the camera operator, you keep the framing the same, but you just drag your finger back and forth to follow the person. So when he goes to the podium, you bring him to the podium, you release, oh, he's walking to the screen, you follow him to the screen, and it readjusts the exposure that way, and it keeps focus on him as well. Just an example. I don't know if that's a great example or not, but that's the only thing I can think of that you would ever use this in movie mode. Exposure step. I don't know why you'd ever want to limit the amount of control you have, but if you wanted to, you could bring this to a half a stop instead of a third of a stop. So let's go ahead and pick it. So now when you change your shutter speed or aperture, watch. I'm going up, and you can see it's going up in very large increments as I move the dial. As the same as with the shutter speed, it moves in very large increments. I would leave this at a third of a stop, and so you have much finer control when you change the aperture and the shutter speed. AEL with shutter, photography, we're gonna skip it. Exposure, standard adjust. So basically what you can do here is go in here, and if you like set this to spot, for instance, you could change this, the metering system, to read differently in a sixth of a stop increment. So basically, if you had two Sony cameras, let's say, and you're using a spot meter right in the center of this gray here, and you've got two cameras pointing at the chart and they're not matching up properly, you could go in here and change it in terms of the metering to get them to match. All right, moving on to page 11, we can actually skip all of these. These are all stills related. Can't do anything with these for video. All right, page 12 of 14 is white balance. I'm gonna have a whole chapter on this. I don't wanna spend too much time on it. The only thing I'm gonna say is, instead of deep diving into the menu to try to find this location, what I'd rather you do is go create a custom button like I did. I put it on the right side of the jog wheel to access the white balance quickly. Priority set and automatic white balance. We're gonna flip around here. We got ambi, and that stands for ambient. Prioritizes the color tone of the light source when you want to produce warmer atmosphere. What I did with this color checker that's on the table, I isolated it within Resolve, and what you can see on the waveform is a resulting waveform of just that white patch. And you can see the red channel is very raised, meaning it's very warm basically. All right, now we're gonna go from white to standard and then back to white. And as you can see on the waveform, the red, the green, and the blue channel are very close together. They're very matched, meaning what we have, that white patch on the table is very, very neutral, which is very good. There's standard. You can see standards is raised. It's a bit warmer on the waveform. And then we go back to white, you can see it's very even, the RGB channel. And then you go to ambient, it's like, wow, that's really warm. So the automatic white balance on this camera has gotten a lot better. But if you want to make it a little bit warmer, use the ambi or ambient. And if you want a very clean white, definitely use the automatic white balance white. That'll give you a bit whiter, maybe more clinical look to it than the standard automatic white balance. Next up is Dro Auto Hdr. The Auto Hdr is going to be grayed out because we're in the movie mode on the dial. We can't use it. But we got two choices here. We can turn Dro off, or we can turn it on to auto, or 5 different levels of dynamic range optimization basically. So let's take a look at some examples. A great way to demonstrate this is the 41-step chart here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring a waveform monitor on right here. And this is with Dro off. Now it's on. You can see a little bump between 20 and 30 IRE. Here it is off and back on again. So if we have a jacket that's kind of in that 20% IRE area, you can see there's quite a bit of difference between having it off versus on. It basically gives you more information in the shadows. But if the jacket is really, really dark, kind of below 20 IRE, and you turn it off and on like here, you're not going to notice that much of a difference. Here's another example with skin. Here's Dro off and it's pretty dark. If I turn it on, it definitely affects the skin, and it affects it in such a way that I don't really like it. So you got to be careful when you have maybe skin that's a little underexposed. All right, creative style. I'm going to basically run through these quite quickly. I have a whole entire chapter on this later, so I don't want to spend much time on it. The only thing I want to mention here is this very powerful tool towards the bottom. There's 6 different numbers that you have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you can set these up to have basically your favorites. And this is a fantastic tool. For instance, if I wanted to change from light, I could change this to, let's say, portrait. I can choose or flick between standard, neutral, and portrait. It's like, portrait doesn't look that great, so I'll go a bake-off between neutral and standard. Neutral, standard, neutral, standard. And it's like, I think I like standard better for this particular doll's plastic skin. This is a fantastic tool for when you're setting up for an interview. You have all your favorites lined up, and then you can kind of do a quick bake-off like I just did, and you can find a creative style that matches well for that person's particular skin. And then cursor overing to the right, we could change the contrast. We can change the saturation, and we can also change the sharpness. Next up is picture effect. I'm just going to run through these quite quickly because they're kind of gimmicky. There's 2 ways to think about this. If you want something, let's say like posterization color, and that's the final look that you want, then go ahead and shoot that way because you might not be able to figure out how to do that in post. But I would say the other method is probably easier, and that is to create something in camera that's very neutral, and then later on create a wild effect like some of these in post later. It gives you more flexibility. All right, next up we have picture profile. I'm going to have a whole entire chapter on this, so I'm just going to run through these quite quickly. All I'm going to say here is if you want to modify them, cursor to the right, and then you can go down to like gamma, for instance. You could change this one to S-Log3 versus S-Log2. This is a very advanced topic, and I'm going to spend a lot of time like on S-Log2 and S-Log3, which are probably the most powerful picture profiles in the camera to help you get the most dynamic range of the camera. So let me show you an example of this. So here is Creative Style Standard, what we were using before. And you can see I underexposed her face a bit, but her sweatshirt looks just fine in terms of exposure. Here her face looks good, but her sweatshirt is overexposed, it's clipped. I won't be able to get that white information back later. Here I'm shooting in picture profile S-Log2. Now her face and her sweatshirt look pretty good. And then after I've graded it, you can see her face and her sweatshirt look just fine as well. So it gives us more dynamic range. And if we were to compare what we had before with creative style with the face that looks good, but the sweatshirt's overexposed versus S-Log2 on the right, where her face and her sweatshirt look great. So you get the best out of both worlds, I guess you could say, in terms of getting the most dynamic range out of the camera. Focus magnifier. We've actually already talked about this, and we've already assigned it to the C1 button. All right, next up, I'm going to cover all 4 of these at the same time. These 3 are all photography related, and this one I'm going to set to 2 seconds. So we're on the M on the mode dial, so photography mode, and I'm just going to reach for the barrel, and I'm going to let's move the box up to her eyes, and I'll get those in focus, and I'm going to release the barrel now. 1001, 1002. You can see it went back out again. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go into movie mode. Now we're in movie mode. I'm going to do the same thing and reach for the barrel, and you can see I'm focusing, but there's no manual focus assist. None of those other type of things are working, unfortunately. So what we have to do in movie mode is hit the C1 button that we've already assigned and then start focusing. And then what's going to happen is once I get the focus, I'm going to release the barrel now, 1001, 1002, and we can see it went back out again. So really the only thing that we've got of these four is the magnification time. And typically I just set this on no limit, so I have plenty of time to get the framing that I want, and then I can actually use the button on the camera like the shutter to zoom back out again. So if I go like this and I press the shutter halfway down, you can see now I'm back into the normal framing. All right, next up is peaking. Inside peaking, we can turn this on or off the display, but remember we've already assigned this to a button, and that's the lower button right here. So you can turn it on. You can see there's some overlay happening. I'll get to that here in just a second. Let's go back into it, and we're going to set the peaking level to high, and let's make this red so it's really obvious. And there we go. And so if you were to wanting to find contrast to focus on, you could take the barrel of your lens and find out where to focus. Now remember, if we press the C1 button, let me adjust the box a little bit up higher, and you can see where you'd be focusing on the eyes. Let's change the peaking level to like mid, and let's change this to white. And then when we zoom in, to me that's just a little bit easier to find on somebody's pupils where you need to manually focus. So that's pretty much for peaking. Peaking is a great tool when you're doing manual focus. When you're in autofocus, you won't see any of this. All right, page 14 of 14, anti-flicker shoot. That has to do with photography. I'm gonna skip that. Face registration. So we're gonna register a new face. I'm just gonna kind of line it up here, kind of fill her face, and hit the shutter button. Take a picture. I'm gonna say enter, and I'm gonna say okay, and let's do another one. Here's another doll from our girls collection down in the basement. Say enter, and say okay. Now we can change the order. We're gonna get to that here in a second, but I'm just gonna get back out. I'm gonna make sure that the registered faces priority is turned on. And I'm going to zoom out on both of these, and what you'll notice is we've got two boxes. A white box, that's our primary or the highest priority, the one it's focusing on, and then the purplish color, I guess you could say, and there could be multiple purples because there could be a secondary. So let's say the doll on the right is your bride and the doll on the left is the bridesmaid, and maybe you have a groom and you register their faces in the morning, you go boom, 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 take their pictures, register them all. And then when they're in a crowd of people and you're shooting video, it's gonna grab onto the one of primary. So we can actually go in and I'll show you how to change the order. So if I wanna take this one and move her here, and now you can see the white box is around her face. I gotta say this has been getting better and better over the years. It's a pretty amazing tool. So another instance would be, let's say you have a person doing a walk and talk on a crowded sidewalk, and they're all mic'd up, and then maybe they're walking towards you, and maybe you're on a gimbal, let's say. This thing works amazing. You have their face registered, and other people in the crowd are moving with them on the sidewalk, just random people, and you're kind of following them, and it's going to lock onto that person's face while you're moving on the gimbal. So yeah, it's pretty powerful how this thing works. And then in here you can just go ahead and delete all. I don't want these faces in my camera, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete them. All right, we're moving on to tab number 2. We're on page 1 of 9, exposure mode, and we already changed this in a previous video to be M. Let's go ahead and explore the other ones. So let's go and start off with shutter priority first. And what I've got here is I got the ISO set to 1600. I'll get to ISO here in a minute, but when I try to move the front or rear dial, you can see that the shutter speed number, the 1/80th for instance right now, red, whereas the aperture number is in white. And you can see that they're both changing as I move things around. So basically if I were to set the shutter at 1/50th of a second, which would work really well for 4K recording, you'll see that it's saying, okay, if you're gonna do that, then the camera's making the decision to put it at f4.5. Aperture priority, kind of the opposite happens. As I move the shutter the front dial or the rear dial around, they both move the f-stop number. And you can see that the shutter is trying to compensate for that to keep the exposure the same. The last one is Program Auto, where I can try to move the front or rear dial and you can see nothing's happening. Now, you could say to yourself, well, shutter speed probably would be the best option, because if I was shooting 4K, I wouldn't want the shutter to change. I want that to stay at like a 50th of a second, but maybe the aperture might change, which is not the greatest thing, because as maybe you're panning from one lighting condition to another, the depth of field might change. Whereas if you were to have this on aperture priority, where your depth of field might stay constant, but the shutter speed might vary and it might create different motion blur as you're panning across a scene, for instance. The best thing to do really is just to put it in M, and if you want the camera to make some choices for you, set your shutter where you want it, set your aperture where you want it, and then on your ISO, just change this to auto. And when it's in auto, the shutter will be locked, the aperture will be locked, but it's going to change the gain or the exposure through the auto ISO, which is probably your best option. All right, on the mode dial, switch over to S&Q, and then we've got S&Q exposure mode. This is exactly what we talked about before. I would definitely recommend leaving this on M for manual exposure, and if you wanted the camera to have some control, just put it on auto ISO. I'm going to skip file format and recording setting for right now. I'm going to go down to S&Q settings, and this first top number that we have 24, 30, and 60. I'm going to kind of describe more about what this means, but think of this as what your resulting timeline will be. So if you're publishing on a 24 frames per second timeline, you'd choose 24p. Or if you were just told, this would be 24p would be more for like movies, or if you want the kind of that filmic look. 30p would be more for television. Our 60p would be like for maybe sports and high action or super realistic type of things. I mean, you can upload like your vlog, for instance, to YouTube at 60p if you want that kind of realistic look. So moving down to frame rate, you can see it says 1 frame per second, and you can see it's recording in the codec of Xavcs HD, so it's a 1080 file, full HD. And the next number is, think of it as the quality. It's at 50 meg. And that's the highest the S&Q can do, is 50 meg. And as we go and we look at more of these, it's going to get lower and lower. And as it gets lower and lower, the quality gets lower and lower. What we've got here is we're capturing 1 frame per second. So we capture a quick fraction of a second, and then another quick fraction of a second. And then when we put them all together, you can watch it back on the camera. You can see it goes really fast, like this time lapse. Now, if you were to compare this to the 4K time lapse that I captured with my remote timer, you'll notice that the 4K file looks a bit crisper, has more detail, which totally makes sense because I had set that up to record 4K basically photos, and then I just put on the timeline and had it do its thing. And in DaVinci Resolve, you can basically just take that whole folder with all the time-lapse pictures, put it on there, they're all JPEGs, and it'll just play back perfectly like it is right here. And it does it in real time, which is pretty amazing. So as we move frame rates up, let's go all the way up to, let's say, 30 frames per second, which again would be more of like for TV, but you'll be putting on a 24 timeline. So if you wanted to, you could actually put these at both at 30, and you can see that the ratio of speed, either quick or slow, has gone away. It means it's a 1-to-1 ratio, which would kind of make no sense to do it this way. Because one of the things happens when you record in S&Q mode is you lose audio. So there's really no reason to ever do it this way. So let's go back to 24, and we'll set this to 30. And you can see we've gone from 50 meg down to 40 meg, so our quality has dropped a little bit, and it's slightly slower at 1.25. Now we'll move up to 60 frames per second. Now you can see our quality has dropped down to 21 meg, and now we're at 2.5 slow motion. And I'll show you an example here of 60p, and it looks pretty good. I mean, this is full HD 1080 material, and it works quite well. And then we're going to move up to 120 frames per second, and what you'll notice here is now we've dropped our quality down to 12 meg, so it's getting even less. And here's an example of 120 frames per second at 12 meg, and it's kind of like the resolution or the amount of detail in the shot kind of drops, and you get more artifacts like aliasing and Moire as well. All right, next up is file format and record setting. I'm going to cover both of these kind of at the same time. They're both very related. Let's take a look at file format. We have AVC HD at the bottom, and that is our worst codec. It's basically how your video file gets encoded into the camera. This is a much older codec. It was done back in the day for DVD authoring. And there used to be actually another one that was even lower than this on the previous camera, the A7R2, that was MP4, and it had even lower bit rates. They just got rid of it. And I have a feeling the next camera that comes out, they'll probably get rid of AVC HD because it's not the greatest codec either. So let's take a look at it really quick. If we go into record setting, we have two options. If you look at the top there, it says 60i. You could either have 60i or 60p. The number itself, 60, just indicates how many frames per second that you have. So you don't see a 24 here, you don't see a 30, so you can't create ones that look kind of movie-like or even for television. 60 is all you get. Next is the I. The I is for interlaced, and I don't know much about interlaced, but all I remember from years ago dealing with interlaced footage, it was just nasty. It had all this weird stuff going on. And I don't know that much about it, but when P came out for progressive, it was like all that stuff just got fixed magically, never had to worry about interlaced frames. It was just a wonderful thing. I would just stay away from the 24M and the 17M that you see there. That's the bit rate, so it's much lower than Xavc-S, and as the lower the number that we have in terms of bit rate, usually the softer or the worse the image is going to look overall. Basically, it's just how much compression. Think of it that way. If you have a really high number like 700 meg, that doesn't have that much compression. You have something like 17 meg, that's a lot of stuff. A lot of the file is being crammed in there. It's going to create a smaller file size, but it's not going to look as good. Also, I would say with AVC HD, it limits you to 2 gig files before it creates another file. So it'll create one file and then boom, it'll create another one. Whereas in Xavc-S, these two options, if you pick one of these, they won't create a new file. They'll just keep recording until they get to 29 minutes and 59 seconds, and then boom, it stops. And it just creates one long continuous file if your card will handle it. All right, moving our way to Xavc, we've got two varieties, one higher resolution, one lower resolution. We're going to start with the higher resolution 4K first, and then we'll move our way down to recording setting. And we've got 4 different flavors. Basically, that first number, 24, is frames per second. The P is for progressive, much better than seeing an I from years ago. Don't want to see an I anymore for interlaced. The 60 meg is the bitrate. So if I were to choose, I would choose 24 at 100 meg if I was shooting for more of a filmic look, and then if I was shooting for television, I would choose this one. Now the Xavc-S codec is actually really, really good. I mean, it's a recent codec. The AVC HD codec we talked about earlier, that's much, much older. I don't even know how old that is. This new codec, when you compare it to some of the other cameras on the market, it holds its own quite well. Let me give you an example. The camera I'm filming with right now is the A6500. It has the same exact bit rates, codecs as this camera in terms of when you're shooting like 4K and stuff like that. When you shoot 4K on this particular camera, not 1080, but when you shoot in 4K, it's comparable to the GH5, the Panasonic GH5, when it records 4K at 10-bit. Now, a lot of people will test this when you like shoot a blue sky gradient, like I'm showing here. And these two cameras just match up. The GH5 at 10-bit versus this A6500. There's like no difference. I can't find banding. And then when you go to when you really push the image, go from like a log footage to you add a whole bunch of contrast, saturation, and stuff like that. Usually that's where you're going to see the image fall apart. And as you can see in this example, the GH5 at 10-bit looks pretty much exactly the same as the A6500 at 8-bit. So moving our way back to a file format, let's go drop down to HD and then see what kind of options we got here. So this is basically 1080. We'll start at the very top. So we've got 60p at 50 meg, 60p at 25 meg. That would be for like more slow motion. The 30p's would be for more of TV, and then 24 you've got 50 meg, and then you go up to 120. You'd have the 100 meg version of 120. Now there's two ways to shoot for slow motion. So let's take a look at what we've got here. We can shoot 120p at 100 meg on this particular setting. So if I choose this, and I were to compare that 100 meg to, let's say, S&Q, and if we're to go to 120 frames per second here, look what it says. It says that one records at 12 meg. So that's much lower than 100 meg. So you're going to get a higher quality for your slow motion if you film in the normal mode rather than the S&Q mode. Now, if we take a look at 60 frames per second, that one's at 21. And then if we go back here to record setting, if we look at here, we can go up to 50 meg. In terms of slow motion quality, I would rather film this way and get audio than S&Q mode. Like I said, I do use S&Q mode sometimes, but mostly it's when I'm in a rush and I just want to basically bring it over, capture it really quickly, and then switch back to, like, say, 4K recording. All right, next up I want to talk about Chroma Subsampling. So you might have heard two numbers when you purchase this camera. One is 420, which comes out of your SD card, and 422, which comes out of your HDMI port. So if you're recording to like an external device like I am, like Adam is Shogun, those are your two numbers. So basically, what does that mean? Well, basically the 420 number means we're throwing out more color information, and 422 is we're keeping more of it. The best number you can have is like 444. I'm not going to dive too much into it. Like I said, I'm no expert on it. I didn't write the Wikipedia page on Chroma Subsampling, but basically what I want to tell you in a nutshell, to make this as simple as possible, and I've been testing these Sony cameras for like the last 3 years and comparing them to other cameras that shoot at much higher bit rates, that shoot at 10-bit, and that shoot at 422 color space. In a nutshell, what you want to do to avoid banding in the sky, blue sky gradient, banding looks like this basically when you shoot it with a crappy camera. You also want to avoid being in a situation where you're in the coloring suite and you're really pushing the image from a log image to more of a normal standard image, and you're really pushing it hard. You don't want it to fall apart and get banding. And the third thing is, if you're doing a lot of green screen work, you want to be able to pull really good keys, especially if you have like this doll here with a bunch of fine hair going into the green screen. You want to be able to pull a really good key. So I'd say in a nutshell, if you want to avoid all of that, just shoot XAVCS 4K and you don't have to worry about it. Because this camera, these Sony cameras behave just as good as 10-bit cameras at 422. I've tested a lot of different over the years, and these Sony cameras just seem to hold up. And I've published a lot of my results on YouTube. Some people try to pick it apart, but a lot of people are like, yeah, there's like no difference between the two. Now, when you shoot in 1080 on this camera, it is different. You can't push the image as far. It'll break apart. Also, you might get blue sky banding, which doesn't happen that often, and you won't be able to pull as good of a key in terms of green screen. All right, I know we haven't talked about proxies yet, and we're just about to get to them, but I want to show you this example while we're still on this topic. On the left-hand side, we have a 4K image, and on the right-hand side, we have a 720 image, and the 720 is a proxy of the 4K. They're shot at the exact same time. This is done in a creative style, and as you can see, I'm panning up into the sky, and I'll pan back down again. You can kind of see maybe ever so slightly subtle banding on the right-hand side. Now when we go flip over to a S-Log example of the same one, so both are being shot at the exact same time, they're both in S-Log, and I've added contrast and saturation in post. But when I start to pan up into the sky, and you can kind of see it right now, these kind of horizontal, slightly curved banding lines that are happening all throughout the image on the right-hand side that are not happening on the left-hand side. Most of that banding, I believe, is coming from the lower bit rate. And I want you to keep that in mind, because when we shoot in slow and quick, what we talked about before, you're going to get much lower bit rates than shooting in our other way of shooting for slow motion. Like when you shoot 120p, you can get 100 meg, or when you shoot at 60p, you can get 50 meg. So definitely keep that in mind when you're shooting with slow and quick, and you're using, or you have a lot of blue sky in your frame. We're going to compare the crop and different frame rates next. So here's 4K 24p in full frame mode. And when you shoot in full frame mode and you switch over to 30p, you're going to get about a 20% crop. So it's going to crop in about 20%, which is different than, let's say, the A7iii, which doesn't have this issue. When we go to 1080 24p full frame, it goes back to the normal cropping. There's 1080 30p, it's pretty much again the same. Here's 60p, so it's using the full entire sensor. here as well. And then of course, if we go to 120p, it looks exactly the same. And just for kicks, I went to 120p S&Q and it looks the same. So all of them are reading out exactly the same way, except for 30p at 4K. So let's compare resolution of 4K 24 on the left, 1080 24 on the right. And as you can see, the 4K is way more detailed. Next up, we have 24 on the left, 60p on the right, and you can see they're pretty much the same. I can't even see any difference. 60 on the left, 120 on the right, and as you can see, in terms of detail, I'm not seeing any difference with this swipe. And then the last one, 120 on the left, 120 S&Q on the right. Again, I'm not seeing much difference. All right, next up is proxy recording. If we turn this on, basically what we've been doing is recording two separate files to our SD card. One will be like your 4K recording, XAVCS, and then the second one will be a proxy, which will also be done in XAVCS. That will be done at 720, so HD, somewhat HD, and also at a lower bit rate of 9 meg. So instead of like 100 meg, it's at like 9 meg. So why would you do this? I can think of two reasons. The things I've never done before, but just hear me out, just a guess. Let's say you were captured a wonderful interview, a 3-minute interview of a CEO, and your producer at the news station's calling, send me that file right away, I need it right away. And you're not near your truck or something like that, I don't know. But basically you could, instead of transferring or trying to transfer your 4K file to your producer, you could just take the proxy file, transfer it to your phone, and then FTP it to your producer at the news station. That would be one example. The other example would be if you have a real weak laptop. A lot of these programs like Resolve, Premiere Pro, Final Cut will allow you to create, segregate your proxy files from your original like 4K files, and you can edit with your proxies, which are much smaller, lightweight files that maybe your weak laptop can handle. And then when you go to actually render, it'll use the actual real or original 4K files. So if you look at the folder structure of your SD card, if we go to private, mroot, and then we go to clip, we can find our 4K file here. And if I open this program called Media Info and I click on HTML, we can take a look at a few different things. The first thing is your 4K file that we recorded was recorded at 100 meg that we can see here. And then if we scroll down, you can see that the resolution is 4K. Now if we go back out to sub, and then we could see that the file numbers are like the same, it's just added an S. And then if we look at the HTML version of this, you can see it's recording at 9 meg in terms of the bit rate. And we scroll down, we take a look at the resolution, and sure enough, it's at 720. All right, on page 2 of 9, we have autofocus drive speed, and we have autofocus track sensitivity. The drive speed is basically how fast it is focusing. So if you've set it to fast, it's going to focus quickly on that particular object it's trying to track. Let's say if it's face detection is turned on, it's going to try to track that face as fast as it can. And then the next one is track sensitivity. You could set this to responsive or standard. And the best way I can describe this is as somebody crosses in front of your frame like this. If you have this on responsive and that person is crossing in front of you, it might want to attach itself, the autofocus, to that person crossing your frame. But if you have it set to standard, it's not going to do that. It's going to like kind of almost disregard something crossing in front of your frame quite quickly. All right, let's show a few examples. This is normal drive speed and standard track sensitivity. This is the way your camera comes, and it's a little bit slow for this type of action, trying to track that middle volleyball player up at the net blocking. And you can see it's a little bit on the slow side. Here's another example of normal drive speed and standard track sensitivity. And you can see these people that are crossing the frame are not interrupting the focus of the volleyball players. So that's a good thing. But when you set the tracking speed to responsive, like right here, you can see that volleyball player just got in the way of the ref's autofocus. And here, I've got it set to fast and responsive. And as you can see, this is just a normal interview. So we don't really have to worry about anything crossing in front of his frame, but I was just kind of curious how well this would work on fast. And I'm shooting this at f1.8, and it did, like I've talked about before, it did a fantastic job. And here's another example, but this one is slow and responsive. So we're gonna watch to see what happens when one of the volleyball players turns around and the camera recognizes a closer face right there, and we lost the ref. And you can see when we lose her face and it going back to the ref, it's doing so very slowly. All right, next up we're going to do is we're going to pull focus between two different items. This is something that you might want to do with your finger on the touch screen, like if you're shooting B-roll or something like that, and you want to get a nice, gentle, very electronic looking focus pull instead of trying to do it manually on the barrel. So let's take a look at some of the examples. I'm not going to cover track sensitivity because there's nothing going in front of the frame or passing in front that the autofocus might want to latch onto. So we're just going to deal with the drive speed. We'll set it to slow first. And you can see that our expanded flexible spot is on her eye. And then I have to take the multi-selector. I can't actually use the touchscreen because I got the HDMI connected. So I'm just going to move that over to the light stand. And then we'll see how long it takes and how smoothly it goes to the light stand. And then I'll go back to one of her eyes. So if you're looking for that kind of smooth response back and forth. Now all lenses are kind of different in this. This 70 to 200 seems to do it nice and smoothly. I have other lenses with older firmware that I haven't even updated that you can see in this example right here kind of is not very smooth. All right, so let's go to normal, see what that looks like real quick. We'll go back to the tripod, and you can see it's much faster, and back to her eye. So it's much faster. All right, auto slow shutter. I recommend not using this, but if you want to see what this does, we'll go ahead and turn this on. And basically what you have to do is go over to page 1 to exposure mode, and you need to be in aperture priority for this to work. And basically what it does is like, hey, it's getting kind of dark in here. What I'm going to do is automatically slow down your shutter speed down to all the way down to a 30th if I need to, which is going to increase motion blur. So I'd rather have control over my motion blur rather than the camera fluctuating it while the light changes. So let's take a look at an example. So you can see here I'm a 30th of a second, f22, because I wanted to create a very dark environment in auto ISO. And you can see the amount of motion blur that's being added to the shot. So that's not something I really want. Audio recording. I like to have audio when I record video, so I leave this on. Audio record level, we actually already talked about this in a previous video. And audio level display. I like to actually see the meters. If I turn this off and then I go into here and I press the display button multiple times to cursor through, you're gonna see I have no audio. But if I go into here and I turn the display on, and then I cursor through, you can see actually, I could see the audio meters, so I could know that I'm recording audio, which for me is important. Audio output timing. You can see here I have my headphones in, my earbuds in, and a lot of times what happens is I'm gonna set up a tripod, I'm gonna be sitting next to it in a chair, and I'm interviewing somebody, and they're looking at me, and they've got a wireless microphone on, and it's being routed to my camera. And I want to hear if there's any dropout, so I can say, hey, let me fix it, can you repeat the answer? If you set this to live, basically you're going to hear everything in sync. This should really say to me in sync. But when you set this to lip sync, everything is really delayed, and you got like a 100, maybe 150 millisecond delay. Yeah, let's go back. That's just really annoying. So basically you have a delay that's really hard to listen to. And so basically what that does, what it says in the manual, it says outputs the audio and video in sync. So basically when, I guess if you're looking at the monitor, or this is being sent to like a control room, and they can actually see on the monitor the audio and the video, like their lips will be in sync. But when you're sitting right next to the camera, yeah, it's so annoying to put that in lip sync. So I would just leave that in live. All right, wind noise reduction. If you turn this on, basically creates a high pass filter around 120 hertz, meaning that everything from like 120 hertz down to 20 hertz, that low, very low frequency of the signal, will pretty much be rolled off. It won't get rid of all the wind noise altogether. It'll definitely help. When I'm outside, I actually will leave this on, depending on what I've got, what microphone I'm using. But if I'm hearing some wind noise, I will actually turn this on so I got that high pass filter in effect, and I can actually hear, and not the signal being dominated by wind noise, I can actually hear the content that I want to hear. All right, marker display. We're going to go ahead and turn this on. And as you can see, I've got a camera here. I'm recording the back of the screen because These are overlays, and it doesn't record. The HDMI is not able to record the overlays. So if we go to marker settings, we see the first one is a center, and I've got that turned on. We'll go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. I don't know the reason for this, but if you want to know the dead center of the frame, that's definitely the tool for you. Moving our way down, we have aspect ratio. I have used this. A lot of times I'll go to 2:3:5 to 1, and if we go ahead and take a look at it, you'll say something like, maybe I need to frame her face more like this. I don't know, maybe we could zoom out a little bit. And then I would add black above and black below, or I would just, when I render the actual file, I'll render as a 2:3:5 to 1 aspect ratio. It's all totally up to you. It's just a great way of knowing where to frame your shot if you're going to basically crop the image later. Moving our way down, we have safety zone, 80% and 90%. Now I'm not a TV guy, but basically it says this has become a standard range that can be received by a general household TV. So if you're trying to stay within that and you're shooting for TV, maybe you need to do that. I'm not a TV guy. And the next one is guide frame. If we have this turned on, we can see that it's basically the rule of thirds with much brighter white lines that are thicker. If those bother you, you want to use like the rule of thirds. I'm going to discuss later in the menu where you can set that up for rule of thirds, which looks less annoying than this does. All right, video light mode. You can see there are a lot of different options here. I don't know what any of them mean, to be honest. If you look at the B&H page for this particular light that you can buy that fits into the hot shoe, from what I understand, reading some of the answers and questions on the B&H page, you can actually have the camera power the light, or the light can be powered by itself. Again, I've never used this before, and that probably goes back to all these different modes that you have here in terms of how it's being powered. But this light is so expensive, and I've looked and there's no reviews. There's lots of questions people have asked, but there's no reviews, probably because it's a $550 light. So I hope it's not too much of a cop-out, but I'm going to basically skip this item. All right, moving on, we have movie with shutter. We've already covered this one, and we've turned it to the on position so we can shoot movies from the shutter. Silent shooting, we're going to skip that. It's photography. This next one is also photography. All right, release without lens. I enable this, so if I want to use third-party glass or a dumb adapter, or I want a lens whack, I don't have to have a lens on the camera in order to take a picture or shoot video. So I enable this. The next one down is release without card. I disable this, so I won't be able to take a picture without the card being in it. But as you can see, it's got a pretty annoying message saying no card, no card. So basically what I do every morning before I leave for a shoot is I format the card. And what does that do? Well, if I format that card, that means that there's a card in it, and it also means that it's got power. And those are the two things that you'll probably forget, is either a battery or having a card. So if you always get into the habit of formatting before you leave, you're pretty much good to go. All right, next up is Steadyshot, and as you can see, Steadyshot is grayed out, and it's because the switch is actually on the lens for the 7200. If you have another lens that doesn't have a switch, you can actually toggle this on and off. And basically what it is the sensor moves around kind of like Jell-O, and it tries to compensate for your movements. Let's say you're walking or you drank too much coffee or something like that, and it's going to kind of even out those shakes. So let's take a look at a few examples. Here I've got Steadyshot turned off, and then boom, you can see I just flipped the switch, and now Steadyshot is turned on, and as you can see, it's producing really great results. So moving down to Steadyshot settings, I leave this on auto. It knows this lens. It knows all my Sony lenses. But let's say you have a third-party lens that the camera doesn't recognize. You're going to have to put this to manual. And let's say you're zoomed all the way to 70, or zoomed out, let's say to 70. So you're going to have to go all the way down here and pick 70. And if you don't pick this right value, and these are out of sync between what you've got on your lens versus what you've chosen here, you're going to get some really nasty it's really nasty and it doesn't look good. And then when you zoomed, let's say I zoom this to 200, I'm going to have to go in here and go all the way to 200 and select it. All right, next up we're on page 5 of 9, zoom. I've got a full frame FE glass on here. I'm going to change that in a minute. I want to show you how this operates first. You can see I'm using my right and left cursor on the jog wheel, and I can zoom in and zoom out. to a 2x magnification. Now I've got this set on clear image zoom. If I go to digital zoom, you'll see that zoom is grayed out and I can't do anything optically because this is a prime lens. All right, now I have the 18-105. It's a PZ, which stands for power zoom. And you can see this top item, zoom now, is grayed out. It says it's invalid with this lens because I can actually, there's a rocker switch on the side, and I can actually zoom in and zoom out as you see here. So let's go back into the menu. And I'm going to change this from optical zoom only to clear image zoom, and then we'll see what happens. Now if I remove the rocker switch, you can see I can go past the 105 number. Now I'm getting into clear image zoom territory. You'll also notice too is face detection works here, but once we get into this clear image zoom area, it does not work. And then we can zoom all the way to 2x. Next we'll go from clear image zoom down to digital zoom, and we'll see what happens. Now if I move the rocker, I can actually go to 4x. A zoom ring rotate. We'll just demonstrate what this does really quick. Left goes wide, so if I'm going to go to the left, you can see it's getting wider. And if I change this to right, and you can see it went the opposite way. So if you're coming from like, I don't know, a Nikon background where maybe it goes the other way, you have a muscle memory built up and it's confusing every time, you can go in here and swap it. Having a lot of different ways to zoom in this camera, from optical, clear image zoom, digital zoom, going from full frame to crop. There's a lot of different ways to go about it to get more reach out of the camera. Let's say there's some object that you want to fill the frame a bit more and you just want to get there. How do you do it? So I wanted to explore some of the questions you might have with, like, let's say clear image zoom or full frame versus crop. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these questions. So the first question you might have is, what's better at 1080 in full frame mode? Is it you're doing it in post or doing it in camera, meaning 2x zoom in post or 2x clear image zoom in camera? What's great about this example is we've got text, skin, and hair all in one frame, so we can take a look. And I would say the winner here is there really isn't one. I'd say it's a tie. Both of these look very similar. Now what's better at 4K? 1.5x zoom in post or 1.5x clear image zoom in camera in the full frame mode? And as you can see, I'm zooming in with the clear image zoom on the right hand side. As we take a look at both of them, I would say the winner is the clear image zoom in this case. And when we punch in a little bit, just looking at the hair texture and the text, it looks like clear image zoom wins here. So in crop mode, what's better at 4K? 1.5x zoom in post or 1.5x clear image zoom in camera? And as you can see, I'm zooming in on the right hand side where I'm using clear image zoom. And I would call this pretty much a tie. They look very, very similar. And then the last question is, what's better at 4K, crop or full frame with 1.5x clear image zoom in camera? So basically it's kind of a crop versus full frame clear image zoom kind of question you might have. And this one, I would say pretty much is a very, very slight. They look almost identical, but I give just a slight win to crop. All right, just to wrap up zoom, the first piece of advice I'd give you obviously is if you're going to need more reach of the camera, do it optically with your zoom lens. That would be definitely the first one. The second one would be definitely shoot in 4K, since we have so much more resolution, and when you're doing any sort of zoom, 4K is definitely going to be way better than 1080. Maybe use crop over full frame with 1.5 clear image zoom. We saw maybe a slight difference between the two. It wasn't that great, but I think the biggest thing I want to say here is don't fear using clear image zoom up to about 1.5 when you're using 4K. You should fear it, however, when you're using 1080. And there's certain lenses that I have, Sony lenses like the 18-105. If I shoot that in 1080 and I use clear image zoom, I always get very disappointing results. But if I use clear image zoom on that lens in 4K, I'm always like, looks great. So you kind of have to be a little bit leery when you use clear image zoom at 1080. On the top of page 6-9, we have display button. Monitor is the screen that's on the back, and Finder is your EVF. So let's go ahead and take a look at monitor first. The way I believe it comes stock is pretty much what you see here. But I'm going to go ahead and turn on graphical display. I'm going to go down and hit enter, and we'll work our way through all the different screens. So the first one is got the graphical display on it, and you can see it's that thing on the bottom right hand side. And if I move the aperture, you can see I'm moving the aperture. I'm basically getting redundant information. I could see the information on the bottom as well as in the graphical display. I really don't need it. It gets in the way. It clutters things up. I don't like having it, so I usually turn that off. Let's hit the display button again. So this one has a lot of information around the edge. I do like having this because you can or learn things, what's going on about the camera quickly. Hit the display button again. It pretty much cleans everything up. As you can see, certain things time out after a few seconds. Let's hit the display button again. We've got the histogram. Hit it again. Level meter. And I use this when I'm using a gimbal a lot just to make sure the gimbal is nice and level. Let's go ahead and hit it again. And then we get into this all information type mode. I just want to say that I am in a M mode on the dial. If you're in the movie mode, I don't think you'll actually see this overall screen of metadata. Let's go ahead and display it again. And it takes us back to the very top. If we go back in, we'll notice that monitor off. If I were to actually, I can't actually demonstrate this because I got the HDMI connected and it won't display a blank screen. So basically monitor off is basically nothing. And that's great if you're doing like, I don't know, time lapses or something at night where you want to just save battery and you don't want to power the screen all the time and you want the battery to last longer. You can just go ahead and turn the monitor off if you're doing that. Next up in the Finder, we have, again, the graphical display, which I don't like to have. We have a display all information, which I don't really need in the viewfinder. No display, I like to have it nice and clean. Histogram, I love having that. And I do occasionally like having the level. So to toggle through there, again, you basically put your eye up to it and then you can just toggle through all the different modes. Next up is Finder Monitor. If you set it to auto, I think that's just a great place to do it with. If I put my hand in front of the eye sensor, you can see the display turns off. You could set it to viewfinder, which is here. And if I set that, I won't be able to see the screen anymore. But if I set it to monitor, obviously I can pass in front of this. I think instead of deep diving into this and using this one, I would always just set this to auto and then pull the screen out if you want the eye detection to turn off. I think that's the quickest way to do it. All right, next up is zebra setting. The first one is you can have this on or off. Remember, we've already assigned this to a button. So if I press this button right here, it turns the zebras off or turns the zebras on. You don't see any zebras yet because we need to go ahead and set them. So what I'm gonna do is bring this to 100 plus. So when I hit this left button, I can turn them off or turn them on. So let's go get back into the zebra levels and explain what these do. So let's go to 100. And in the manual, it doesn't discuss what range it gives you that you're seeing right here. If it was just 100 IRE, you wouldn't see many zebras. Basically what it's showing you is from 95 to 105. It's plus or minus 5. And how do I know that? Is because here under custom, we can set this to standard plus range. I think that's what it means. And we can go all the way to 100, let's say. And then we can set this to plus or minus 5. And this looks exactly like this. So I know, see this 100 looks exactly like this one, which is 100 plus or minus 5 IRE. So what is IRE? We're going to talk about this more later, but basically if you have a scale from 0, which is complete blackness, to 100, which is white, that's your IRE scale from 0 to 100. Now this camera records in the super whites from 100 to 109, and you can recover some of those, which is great. So you can use this in a bunch of different ways. If, for instance, you wanted to set this, let's say behind her instead of gray was actually green for a green screen, I could lower this and find out where that is. And there it is. I could even change the tolerance, the range right here, and I could evenly light the back of her so the green screen could be easily composited. But I typically don't use it that way. I typically use this one right here, the lower limit. And what the lower limit is, it's saying anything at this number 109 plus, I'm going to show you zebras. So if I bring this I'm not going to bring it all the way down, but like to 80, that's 80 all the way up. It's showing you where the zebras are. But if you're going to use this as an overexposure tool, remember we can record into the super whites, we can go all the way up to 109. But I found out through my testing that you'll still lose some detail like in the red channel of her forehead at 109. And the safest place to put this is at 100 plus. or you could use this one, and they're very, very similar. But this is different. This one is plus or minus 5 at 100, so it's really 95 to 105, whereas this one is 100 plus, and this one, the way I've set it up, is 100 plus. So I typically set these like right here, and then I just use my left cursor basically to turn it on and off to know where I'm overexposing the image. All right, next up is grid line, and the first one we're going to do is rule of thirds grid, and rules can meant to be broken in terms of definitely when it comes to composition. But if you're doing an interview, you might want to set the camera like right like this, and interview the person that way. Interview the doll. Next one is square grid. I could see using this in, like, if you're using a wide angle lens and you're shooting a lot of architecture, and maybe you're using a tilt shift zoom kind of thing. You're trying to line things up, and you need all those basically grids on your screen to line things up. I think that might be useful. I've never used it that way. Diagonal and square grid. So this one has these things that are coming in. My guess is I'll read the manual what it says, but this could be really useful for when you're zooming and you're trying to keep something in the center, and it's like a zoom guide basically. Let me read off to what they say in the manual though. Place the subject on the diagonal line to express an uplifting and powerful feeling. So I'm not exactly sure where they're going with that, but for me, this I think would be kind of a useful tool for when you're using a power zoom. All right, exposure set guide. This is turned off by default, which is a good thing. Let's turn it on. I'll show you why it's so annoying. If I move the aperture, the shutter speed, or the ISO, you'll see this big pop-up thing come up, and it's basically just redundant information. It clutters up your screen, gets in the way. Now, what you'll notice on my screen there is I've got the histogram, and what's the one thing I want to have when I'm changing the exposure is the histogram. But if I move the dials, boom, the histogram goes away. It's like, wow, that's the one thing I want. All right, next up is live view display. Settings, effects, on or off. So basically, what does that mean? That's basically exposure, white balance, and creative styles. If you turn this off, it basically kind of gets rid of those. If you leave it on, it's more of like a what you see is what you get, sort of. And let me kind of explain. This is more of a stills related item, but since you can record video in a stills mode, let me just demonstrate what this does. So if I'm going to leave this on for right now, and you can see I got a pretty dark image, and you look at the histogram. So I'm in M on the mode dial, so I'm in a stills mode. I'm going to hit record. And you're going to notice for the most part, you can see the histogram's changing slightly. It changed a little bit. But for the most part, what I saw on the back of the screen is pretty much what I got. So let's go ahead and hit stop. Change this to off. Now, the image got a lot brighter. You look at the histogram, it's mostly full now. Now if I go hit record, video, you can see now the histogram's like half full or less than half full. So it's not what you see is what you get. So if you're one of these people that like to shoot videos in a stills mode, I would highly recommend leaving this onto the on position, and that way you'll have a much better idea of what you're filming before you hit the record button. Continuous shooting length. It doesn't have an icon next to it, but I'm pretty sure it's photography only, so we'll go ahead and demonstrate. I'm in an M on the mode dial, and let's go ahead and take a look at what we have here. We have a new item on the left-hand side of the screen, that vertical bar, and if I do a burst, you'll see that bar actually move, and it's basically, I think the manual says, the remaining time for which continuous shooting can be performed. That's the indicator that you have there. But when we're in movie mode, you can see that there is not a bar. And if I hit record, there's no bar, there's no time remaining or anything. So this is definitely a photography only item. Auto review. There's no icon next to it, so let's explore it really quickly. I've set this to 2 seconds for this demonstration. I'm in the stills mode. I'm going to take a picture and put my hand in front of it. And you can see that it held for about 2 seconds, and now you can see my hand. When I go to video mode, and I record a video, and I stop the video and I hold my hand in front of it, yeah, it's not holding. So I don't know why there's no icon in front of it. All right, top of page 8, we have custom key for photography, custom key for video. We've already covered these already in the previous video. And then we got custom key for playback. I'm just gonna show you really quickly. The only thing I've changed here is I've changed this to rating. So the C3 button on the back of the camera, when I'm reviewing images, stills, I can rate them and I bring them in Lightroom and they're already tagged, which is fantastic, so I can sort quickly. On the video side of things, unfortunately, you can try rating, but I haven't found any NLE that'll carry that meta information over into like Resolve, Premiere Pro, or Final Cut to actually work. Function menu set, we've already covered that in a previous video. Dial setup, again, this goes back to muscle memory. Let me demonstrate this really quickly. So the front dial right now controls the aperture, rear dial controls the shutter speed. If I go in here and I flip it, basically the opposite happens. If I start moving the front dial, you can see it's moving the shutter. So if you're coming from a background of a different camera manufacturer and your muscle memory is already set up for a certain way, you can reverse this from the way it comes default. AV TV rotate. So basically, if it's normal, when you move the dial, it moves normally. If I put it reverse, let me demonstrate. So I'm going to move the dial to the left and you can see the aperture numbers going up. And if I go back in and I turn that and I go to the left again, you can see it's going down. So again, it goes back to muscle memory. If you're coming from a different manufacturer, this might help you out. All right, next up is Dial EV Comp. I gotta admit, originally I thought this was a photography only item, but I actually made this work. If you wanted to do it this way, I don't recommend it. But if we go to page 1 of 9, you can see I got the exposure mode set to shutter priority. So let's go back to page 9. And under here, we got it set to off. And let me just demonstrate, show you what's happening. I'm gonna just move the rear dial around, which I'm changing the shutter speed, as you can see. And you can see that both the shutter speed and the aperture are changing, basically trying to keep the exposure constant, basically. So I'm gonna put this back at 50th of a second. Now I'm gonna go back into the menu and change this to front dial. Now watch what happens when I move the front dial. You can see that the exposure is changing. So it's going down by 2 stops and I can go up by 2 stops. I can't go any more than 2 stops. So I can actually control the exposure with the front dial while in shutter priority exposure mode. Would you ever want to do it this way? I don't know, probably not, because moving this dial around all over the place is not the best, and you are changing the depth of field constantly as you're moving the dial. Again, I would use auto ISO if you wanted the gain of the camera to be controlled automatically. Movie button. We've got always and movie mode only. So obviously always doesn't matter what mode you're in, but if we set this to movie mode only and I'm in stills mode right now and I go to hit the movie button, it says invalid in this mode. You got to be in movie mode. So it's a way, I think this was originally done in the previous camera where the movie button was in a real awkward situation and you might bump it. And people didn't like bumping it, so they wanted to be able to turn it off. So that's probably why that's there. Lock operation parts. So you go in here, you can have the multi-selector, this one, the dial and wheel, this one. I'm just gonna set this all for this example. So if I get out of here and I press and hold the function button about 3 seconds, you'll see a message come up saying everything's locked. And sure enough, I try to move this, try to move this, try to move this, try to move this, nothing's happening. So if I press the function again for about 3 seconds, it'll say unlocked. And now I can go on and change things. Audio signals. I like having the audio signals turned on, mostly just because I want to be able to hear when it starts recording and when I end recording. So obviously I can go ahead and turn this off. I can hit record, it doesn't make a sound, hit record again. Now if I go into a stills mode and I've got this turned off, and let's say I'm a photographer, videographer doing weddings and I want to keep it as silent as I can, obviously the shutter is going to make sound, so it's not totally silent. You'd have to go in and put this to the electronic shutter rather than the mechanical shutter to make this a totally silent camera. All right, we're on networking. Page 1 of 2, send to smartphone function. So first thing I'm going to do is go down here and I'm going to make sure this is set to proxy only. If you try sending the originals, it's going to go really slow for this example. So I'm just say proxy only. And then I'm going to go up here and I'm going to say send to smartphone. And I'm going to say select on this device. So basically the one I am currently parked on, this particular video file, I'm going to say this image. So when I asked you to choose a network, go ahead and pick the one that starts with direct. Then go to your Play Memories mobile app, which you'll have to download before, and then you'll just wait for the proxy to come in. Then within your Photos app, you can just go ahead and hit play. Testing 1, 2. This is with Proxy turned on, transferring to the iPhone. And then once you're ready to share, you can go ahead and hit the share button and probably scroll over to where it says Google Drive and upload it that way. That might be the fastest way, or some other FTP method. Just to add on to that, when you make the connection and you transfer the file, the connection will terminate automatically between the camera and your phone. And a few other things just to think about. You cannot transfer 4K footage, you can't transfer AVC HD footage, and you can't transfer 120 frames per second footage. All right, next up is send to computer and FTP transfer. This is more for stills photography. Like FTP transfer is like if you have the Sony A7iii and you've got the Cat5 connector connected, you're on the sidelines of a sporting event, you're shooting away with JPEGs. That Cat5 cable goes up to the press box and somebody's curating them and sending them out to the AP service or something like that. I'm not a stills photographer sports, but that's normally how it would be used. This camera doesn't have a Cat5 connector, so you'd have to set up a wireless FTP access point, similar to send to computer. You can't do this through the USB cable. It has to be done wirelessly. I can't think of a reason of why you'd want to do this for video. In fact, in the manual for send to computer, it says you can't even send proxy files. In FTP, I've done a lot of research online. It seems like it's stills only and it doesn't talk about video at all. So if you're trying to send video files, again, I would take the SD card out and put it in a card reader, or you would use the USB cable, which would transfer things a lot quicker than trying to do it over the air. So we're just going to go ahead and skip these two. All right, next up is view on TV. It's grayed out because I have the HDMI connector connected on it, but if it was not connected, it would not be grayed out, and if I would select it, it would basically try to start a wireless connection. And it would try to look for a Sony TV that has a DLNA renderer. I don't have one of those TVs, so unfortunately I can't demonstrate. That might be cool for maybe pictures, but if you're using video, I would just use an HDMI cable from the camera to your TV. It works on every TV, so I'd much rather do it that way and play back rather than trying to do it wirelessly. All right, next up we have control with smartphone. This used to be in like the apps section, but now we just have it in the network section. So let's go ahead and see what we got here. Control with smartphone, I've got this turned on. You can have this always connected, which I wouldn't recommend. It might drain the battery. So basically what we want to just make the connection, and then after you're done with it, it disconnects. So I'm going to go ahead and initiate a connection. Again, go ahead and select your one that starts with direct. Then go into your Play Memories app, and then you'll be able to control different things like, for instance, your f-stop number. I can increase this, and after a few seconds you see it'll get darker. We'll go ahead and reset that one. You can change the ISO. Let's go ahead and increase that. That works great. In the menu you can do a bunch of other things like white balance, and you can also change the way the display is, and you can also rotate it if you like. But if you were to compare this to Panasonic's app, this is not as robust, but it'll definitely work if you need it to. Airplane mode. If you turn this on, basically it disconnects the Wi-Fi and the GPS. So the Wi-Fi that we talked about before, like you're transferring a video file, after the video file is transferred, that connection will just automatically terminate. If you're using GPS, however, to send longitude and latitude information GPS-wise to your camera as you're taking pictures, this won't work for video, then that can drain your battery, and you might want to turn airplane mode on when you want to save battery. All right, Wi-Fi settings. Like I said before, FTP and send to computer, from what I can understand and what I've seen in the manual, you can't transfer video files, so this would be more for photography, so there's no real reason to set this up. Bluetooth settings, again, if you're using your smartphone to send GPS information to your camera, can't do that for video, so we're going to skip that. This is location information link set. Again, this has to do with their GPS data going from your phone to the camera. Again, it can't do that for video. Edit device name. You can go in here and change the device name to what it appears to other people on the Wi-Fi network. We're going to go ahead and skip that because we're not going to set that up. This has to do with, I believe, FTP settings, and then you can basically reset everything back to the way it was default when you got the camera. All right, page 1 of 3, protect. You can go in here and do multiple images, all with the same date, but basically, if you are in the habit of formatting like I am, it doesn't matter what you protect, they're all going to get deleted if you format. Rotate, that's stills only, can't rotate an image or video file. Delete, I usually don't delete from here. You can go in here and select multiple if you want. I usually delete while I'm cursoring through the playback. Rating, like I said before, you can rate images, but you can't rate videos, so it doesn't apply here. Rating set, again, you can't rate video files, so I'm going to go ahead and skip it. And obviously we can't print videos, so we'll skip this one as well. All right, page 2 of 3, we have copy. So basically what you can do here is copy all the images from your primary card, like slot 1 to slot 2. Like it says here, copy all images with this date to the memory card in slot 2. So I'm going to say OK, and it's going to start prepping it. Now as it starts, you basically got to make sure that you've got a card that can receive video files like Xavc. So it's got to be kind of the same type of card, or this won't work. I tried it with other cards and it came up and said, nope, can't do that. So this is a kind of a good way of copying from one card to another if you need to back things up. Next one is photo capture. So what we can do is if you've already selected a video file that you're parked on before you hit this, you can actually go ahead, I'm going to hit play or the center select button. I'm going to find a frame that I want, and I'm going to press the down button, and it processes it. And basically what it does is just takes a still. So if I go into playback mode, I should have 2 files on here. The first one is the movie file, and then it takes a resulting JPEG image basically of that video file. So if you need a certain still from a video file out in the field and you maybe want to put it on Instagram or send it to your producer or something like that, you can definitely do that here. All right, next up is enlarge image. We can't enlarge a video file. We can't zoom in on it. It's just going to say unable to magnify. This is also stills related. We'll skip this one. This one is stills related, but it's kind of cool. I'm just going to mention it really quick. I definitely set this to focus position. So if like you're doing a portrait and you're shooting at like f1.4 and you're wondering if you got the focus right on the person's, let's say, eye. So where it focuses, it's going to zoom into, like the eye. And if it didn't nail focus, it might go to the tip of the nose or the back of the ear, and you're like, oh, I can quite quickly see that I didn't get the focus right. I think that's kind of cool for stills, but it has nothing to do with video. All right, next up is slideshow. Typically what I use this for is a couple different reasons. One is I'll just take the camera, take the HDMI, connect it up to a TV. Let's say I'm on vacation or something like that. Shot the whole day of video, and I'll just go here to slideshow. I'll go in here to set interval to 1 second. So there's only 1 second interval between one video file ending and one starting. I'll demonstrate that here in a second. And then just let it roll. Go cook dinner or something like that and watch it on the display. Or let's say you're out on a shoot and the producer wants to see all the B-roll or stuff that you captured, and there's a monitor right there. Just set it up for them, hit play on slideshow. We'll do that right now. Just hit enter. And basically it's just going to play one video file after the next. There's usually a little bit of gap. You'll see it come up right about here, I think it is. You'll see the axis light flash a little bit, and then boom, it goes to the next one. So there's a slight lag between videos, but it's not too bad. So you can review footage quite quickly. All right, at the top of page 3 of 3, we have select PB media. PB stands for playback. So let's go ahead and select a card. We'll select slot 1. We can see we have 2 images. And then we'll go here to slot 2. And we also have these 2 exact same images because I had copied one card from one to the other previously. View mode. I should also call this freak out mode. Let me explain why. And I've done this before. I'm like, So if you go into view mode, you can choose a lot of different ways to view the images in playback mode. You can do it by date, which is pretty obvious here. You can see the calendar. I can cursor over here and I can use this part of the menu in a different interface. I can do folder view, and it doesn't say it right here, but this is stills only. If we go back to the other interface, it says stills only. So I can see all the different stills. Now here comes the problem. If I go back to here and I say, well, I want to look at all of my Xavc video files basically, and I can see them. And then when I get out of this interface, maybe I turn the camera off, I turn it back on, I hit the play button on the back, and I'm like, I can see all my video files, but all of my still images are gone. I lost them all. Where'd they go? I'm freaking out. So that's why I call this the freak out mode. So if you use this with a lot of caution. You'll freak out like, I lost everything. If you ever get in that situation, go to this part of the menu and make sure that you set everything back to date view. And then you can see things, all of the things chronologically. Image index, this is pretty easy. You can either set it to 9 images or 25. Let me just show you real quick. That shows you in groupings of 9. And then if you have really good eyesight, you can group in 25 as well. Display continuous shooting group. This is stills only, but basically if you shoot a burst like that, well, it'll only show you like the first image of the burst if you turn this to the on position. Display rotation. This is for playback of stills only. You can set this to auto, so when you turn the camera, the image will turn with it basically in playback mode. So you don't have to tilt your head, but this has nothing to do with video because I've tried it on video files and it will not rotate the video file. Image jump setting. This is kind of cool, but it's only photography, unfortunately. You could set up the front dial or whatever dial you want. I usually like having a front dial, and I set this to a 5-star rating because when I press the C3 button for my images, I can rate them at 5 stars instantly. And then what's great is you can, with the front dial, play back just those 5-star images. If you use the jog wheel in the back, you can cursor through all of them. Unfortunately, like I said before, if I go ahead and hit play, and I hit the C3 button, it says unable to perform rating on this image. So I wish we could rate our video files. All right, monitor brightness. You can have this on manual and you can actually increase or decrease. You can also go in here and set this to sunny weather. And what's fantastic about this camera, you can shoot in 4K sunny weather, which is just fantastic because the previous version, let's say you're out in a gimbal outside and the sun's hitting the back of the screen and it was really dim when you're shooting 4K and you could barely see anything. Now we can finally see. All right, next up is viewfinder brightness. Here I can't really show you what's going on, but basically you've got auto and you got manual. And basically for this particular camera, when I'm using this eye cup basically, and it seals really well around my eye, it really doesn't matter if it's in auto or if I put it in manual and then change it because it makes such a great seal around it. So to be honest, I just leave it in auto. All right, next up is finder color temperature. I would recommend not adjusting this at all because this could really screw up your white balance. Basically what it does is it changes how warm or how cool the image is. I would leave it right at the 0 setting. All right, next up is gamma display assist. So what you can do here is you can record the image very flat using like S-Log, let's say, for example, and then you can monitor in more of a contrasty, different way so you can judge things like focus and exposure a little bit better. But I don't use it. Let me show you why. So let me get out of here, and you're going to see that the light meter right here says I have a properly exposed image. But if you look at the histogram, it's like, man, boy, it looks awfully dark. But what we're going to do is we're going to go into Gamma Display Assist and we're going to change this to S-Log 2, which is what I have it turned on to. And now you can see the display looks better. It's still pretty dark, and you can look at the histogram. Histogram really hasn't changed at all. Histogram looks really dark. But what we're displaying, let's say if you're trying to get focus on something like that, it's really hard to do that on a flat image. But here, it looks a lot better. But the problem is it's a very underexposed image. This is how I normally do it. So I'm going to turn this off right now, and I'm going to bring up the exposure to where I think it's correct. And I'm going to cover this more later in the S-Log chapter. But I'm going to bring this up to where the histogram is somewhat full or kind of in the middle. And that's usually, as you can see, I'm about 2 stops over. But that works really well. I'd say it's probably somewhere around here is where I'd normally shoot S-Log 2. But the problem comes in when I go into Gamma Display Assist and I bring this to S-Log 2. Yeah, there's more contrast, but to me that looks overexposed. So if I was using this tool and I was making exposure changes based off of it, I'd be like, you know, that looks kind of bright. I'm going to start bringing this down to where maybe it looks a little bit better over, I don't know, down here. But later on when I bring it in post, I'm going to be dealing with noise issues in the shadows. And we'll cover this more later in the S-Log chapter. All right, volume settings. This is where you control the volume of the playback of your video file. Has nothing to do with like the sounds in your camera, like when you start or end recording. If I were to bring this down, it's not going to bring the those beepy type sounds down. It's just the playback. I would never really deep dive into the menu and control it this way. I would actually hit the play menu. If you want to get to that quickly, hit the down part of the jog wheel and you'll be able to get to it much faster. And then you can just use the left and right to control it. Delete confirm. I kind of live on the edge. This is the way it comes default. It comes up with a cancel. So you actually have to add an extra step. If you do this one, you don't have to do an extra step. So let me demonstrate. So if I want to delete this video file, I'm just gonna hit the trash can button. You can see it comes right up to delete. Boom, I hit it, I'm done. Instead of adding an extra button press to the process. All right, next up is display quality. We have two different choices. Standard saves battery life and keeps the temperature low. High increases the resolution, which increases the temperature and decreases the battery. Now I've spent a lot of time on this trying to see the difference between standard and high, especially in the EVF. That's one that's most important to me, but I've looked at the back of the monitor, back of the camera as well, and I couldn't see any difference between standard and high. Here we are actually looking, I put a camera inside the EVF and ran a bunch of tests in terms of seeing if I could see any difference in terms of resolution or like even refresh rate. Sometimes you can actually see that happen. And what you see here is I've actually zoomed in or punched in 4x on the C1 button to see if I could see any differences there as well inside the EVF, and I couldn't. Now I have a Sony rep that I've contacted. And he wrote back to me about display quality, and he said it's purely for power consumption. He says it has to do with display resolution. He said that high shows the full screen resolution while standard shows slightly less. Now, my take on this is I can't see any resolution difference on the monitor or the EVF in video mode for both capture and playback. Now, many others in the forums can't either. I've looked and asked other people and they had problems seeing the difference between the two as well. I would say leave it on standard because it increases battery life. One test that I saw online, the person said it actually saved 20% of the battery when you set it to standard. The only thing I could see was a slight refresh difference between the two when I was switching back between high and standard. Power saves start time. So basically what this does is it starts counting down as soon as you take your hands off the camera and you do nothing. In 5 minutes, it'll go to sleep. It doesn't turn off, it just goes to sleep, and you can just basically hit the shutter to wake it back up again. Obviously, we got lots of different times here, and for me, this really doesn't matter because I've got this turned on, which we're going to discuss here in a little bit down the menu. When you turn on the remote control function for this camera, all of these settings just go out the window. It just stays on forever and it never goes to sleep. Auto power off temperature. So there's two settings you can do. Standard, which will allow your camera to basically shut down automatically, even in like 80-degree weather outside or the sun's hitting it. I set this to high and you'll get this warning message, but I say okay anyway. Basically, if you shoot a lot of 4K outside, and I've done this like on pool decks. I haven't done it with this camera yet because it hasn't gotten hot enough yet outside, but on the previous Sony cameras, I just set them all to high. I've run tests where the camera's cool and versus where it's just about to overheat, and I've looked at the video files and they look the same. The video file is not getting noisy or something else happening to it. It looks fine. Obviously, heat is the enemy of electronics. Most of the times I only use these cameras for about 2 or 3 years and then I sell them and I buy another one. I'm not keeping them for 10, 15 years. Will this degrade the overall life performance of the camera? Possibly. But if you keep your cameras for as long as I do, I don't think you'll ever have to worry about it because I've never heard anybody in the forums talk about their camera died because they had it on the high setting. NTSC PAL selector. So I'm guessing if you are in the United States, you got this camera shipped in NTSC mode. If in Europe, you probably got it shipped in PAL. So if you are going through the course in Europe and you see all these numbers I've been showing in these examples, like 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, and you've been like, well, wait a minute, Dave, I see 50 frames per second and I see 100 frames per second, not 120. What's going on here? That's because you're set to PAL versus NTSC. Now, let's say you're in Europe and you're shooting outside in the sunlight and you want to overcrank the camera more to get more slow motion. You want that 120 frames. Well, just switch over to NTSC. You're good to go. But when you move inside in Europe, when you're in artificial lighting and it's coming off at 50 hertz rather than the United States with 60 hertz, Then you're going to want to switch over to PAL so your lighting and the camera are more synced so you don't have any sort of flickering or banding issues. All right, next up is cleaning mode. So if you go into here, it performs an image sensor cleaning. Basically it'll vibrate, so listen to it when I hit enter. So basically what it is, it basically ultrasonically vibrates the sensor and drops the dust, and it goes to a sticky pad on the bottom, so then it doesn't reflow inside the chamber and get back on the sensor. At this point, you're going to want to take the lens off while you see this message right here. So the camera's still on. I'm going to go ahead and lie it down. I'm going to take one of my dry swabs. So that's what the swabs look like. There's definitely some on there. So I'm going to blow this out. Take a quick look at it. And there's still some dust on there, so now I'm going to use this. Now remember, camera's still on, still has the message on there. I'm going to put it down, and I'm going to move across the sensor like this, and then I'm going to move back the other way. Now I'm going to take a look, and it is nice and clean. So now you can turn the camera off. And when you're done, you just throw that out, and you're good to go. All right, next up is touch operation. Right now I have it turned off, so if I just go into here and I try to touch on the rocket blower that I was just using to clean the camera, nothing's happening. But if I go into the menu and I turn touch operation on, now I can go between her face, and when it locks, you can see the spot focus holds, and then it blinks when it's focusing, and when it's done, it stops. So I can go back and forth between the two. Touch panel / pad. This is a little confusing how they've worded this. Let me see if I can help you remember how I remember it anyway. Is think of it as an iPad being small, and think of like a panel as being very large. And if you remember those two things, you'll remember this. So if I go to panel, meaning large, that is this display basically. We're touching the display. So if I touch the display, I can go between the doll's face and here. Now if I go here to pad only, that means I'd be looking through the viewfinder and using my finger on the screen. So if I'm not looking through the viewfinder right now, you can see it's not working. But if I cover over this, now I can change this on the panel because I'm looking through the viewfinder, and I can change the focus points. So it's a little confusing. I typically just leave this in both, so I have the flexibility to hold it up to my eye and use my thumb as the focus point. Touchpad settings, touch area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go all the way to the top here, so this is easier for you to conceptualize. This has to do with when you're looking through the viewfinder. It has nothing to do with using this on the back. So if I were to hold my eye up to this viewfinder and I were to take my thumb and I move it around the screen, right now I have this set to the whole entire screen. And so I have to move my thumb all the way up to the corner, like near my cheek, and back down here to make it move. That's not the best way to do it. I found like the lower right is the best place. And this graphic is terrible because you see the white part is what's not being selected. It's translucent that you can see through to the orange background. That's the actual area that you're looking for. So lower right, now when I put my thumb around this area, just on the, I can move that quite quickly instead of trying to go all the way up to the upper left-hand corner of the screen. Where it's kind of difficult for me to demonstrate is this next one, absolute versus relative position. If I have it on absolute position and I have that lower quadrant right here activated, when I look through the viewfinder, if I were to take my thumb and put it down anywhere on the screen, it's going to go to that location. And then I'd say if I move it up here, it would go to that location like this. Now if I were to set this to relative position, when I put my thumb down, let's say the focus point is in the upper left-hand corner, even if I put my thumb all the way down at the bottom and I were to move it to the right, that would move that point, even though it's at the top of the screen, it would move it to the right, even though it was on the bottom, because it's the relative position. All right, demo mode. This is something probably you'll never ever use. So let me just demonstrate. If I turn this on and I were just to let this camera sit for about a minute, you've got to have AVC HD files, video files, and they have to be protected. And then about after a minute of not touching the camera, those AVC HD files will start playing in a loop, basically automatically. The only reason I can think of this would be in a store like Costco or Best Buy or something like that, where they're wanting to play back some of their stuff on the screen for you, and then you go up and touch the camera and then something else happens. You know, you can use it and then the person walks away from the stand and then it goes back into that demo mode and then maybe it's showing commercial. Timecode and user bit settings. All right, I'll be honest, I have very little knowledge about timecode, and a lot of these items that are in the manual online are very vague and extremely hard to understand and even try. Let me go through them really quickly, and I'll tell you the stuff that I do know, and I'll tell you an environment where I do use timecode, and it works pretty well. Let me explain. So let's get out of here, and in the lower right left-hand corner, you see where it says standby. Just below that, you'll see the number counting up as I record. So let's go ahead and stop that. Now, if I set this to timecode, you'll see that there's a number, 6 hours, 18 minutes, 43 seconds, blah, 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 so many frames. If I hit record, you can see that number just keeps going. It's because of the certain mode that I'm in, and this is the mode I like to be in. It's just called free run. You see down here where it says free run, if I set this to rec run, when I hit record, the time code will start. When I hit stop, it stops. I don't like using it that way, because if I have two cameras and like the 6500 and this camera, I will use this remote, and on this remote it says TC reset. That's time code reset. So what I'll do is I'll line them right up to next to each other, and I'll press that button. I'll blast them with IR, and they reset. They basically bring their counter back down. So if I go to here and I click trash can to hit reset and I come back out of here, you'll notice that it's all zeros. And let's go ahead and make sure that we're on free run so we can actually watch the numbers go. That's where you would actually reset, is just hitting the trash can, and then you'll see that it should start over again. The situation that I normally use it for is like if the cameras are in two physically different environments. Like one is inside of a gym, let's say it's a wide shot of a volleyball court, and let's say the next camera is up in the mezzanine level behind glass and it's shooting down on the floor. Well, I can't sync up the audio in that situation because they're in two separate rooms. So what I'll do is, like I said before, I'll line them up, blast them with the IR, have them reset down to 0, and have it done on this free run, so it's always constantly going. That number on the bottom is always going. And so when I start and stop the cameras and then I bring them into my NLE, I'll just say sync these two cameras up via timecode, and then bloop, they all line up, and then I'm ready to go. And usually these cameras will drift. Timecode in these cameras, I think there's a quartz crystal, if I'm correctly, that type of clock. It'll drift about a frame per, I'd say 45 minutes to an hour. So if you have time, like after another game is done, blast it again. There's other cameras that are out there that don't have that kind of weak clock built into them, and you can go pretty much, 4 hours or 8 hours before they get out of sync. These cameras get out of sync really fast. So sorry, I don't know a lot about timecode, but hopefully that one example that I just gave you will help you if you ever find yourself in that situation. Remote control, we've already talked about this already, but this is where you would turn it on if you wanted to use this kind of IR blaster type device, IR remote. I like having it on and using it. I'm using it right now with this camera. I'm turning it on and off, so I don't have to get up and go around. But when you turn it on, like I said before, it'll never go to sleep. HDMI settings. Starting at the top is HDMI resolution. Auto pretty much says coming out of the HDMI to, like, for instance, I'm going into my Shogun. I set it to auto and it works great. Basically, it's kind of a handshake between the camera and the device. Well, it doesn't have to be a Shogun. It could be like a TV, for instance. And it just kind of knows. They talk to each other and say, what are you sending me? Okay, I'll take it. In this case, I'm sending it just a 1080 signal because that's what I have to do in terms of these menus. These menus don't come out at 4K, but I can set it to 1080 if I wanted to, or 1080i if I wanted to, or 4K/1080. For the most part, just try auto. It'll probably work just fine for you. So it's basically just what's coming out of the HDMI in terms of the resolution. The next one down, this is the output again of the HDMI. Do you want it to be 24p or 60p? I normally just set it to 24p, and some devices won't even be able to record 60p at like 4K or something like that. HDMI info display. Right now it's turned on, so you can see actually what's going on here. If I turn it off, there would be, I would call a clean signal. And what you've got now is somewhat like a dirty signal, because if I get out of here, you can see all that information on the bottom, like the shutter speed and all that stuff. If I had turned that off, all that stuff would go away and that would fill the frame, because you don't want to record a dirty signal. The only time you want to do it is like when you're doing a course like this. Timecode output. If you turn this on, basically it's going to take the timecode that's inside the camera and send it to your Shogun or whatever device. And if you set your Shogun up to receive it, basically. And you guys can't see it, but there's an overlay, and sure enough, it's tracking with what I've got on the camera. So if you want to have those two synced up, basically. Record control. I could never get this to work, but basically if you turn this on, basically what should happen is if I press the record here on the camera, it should also record on the Shogun. And if I hit stop, it should stop it. But I've never gotten that to work. I've been to like NAB trade show and walked up to the booth and they demonstrated to me, and it's like, yeah, it's working there, but it's never worked here. So I have a feeling it's either my cable or it's the Shogun that I have. It's one of the very first ones, and maybe something's wrong with it. But from my understanding and what I've seen demonstrated at the trade show, it does work. So you could trigger both of them at the same time from the camera. And the last one is control over HDMI. So you need a Sony Bravada TV for this to work. I'm not really going to go into it, but it's kind of a convoluted, weird way of using the remote control and how it controls things. But it's really confusing. You could read it in the manual, but unless you have a Sony Bravada TV, which I'm guessing a lot of you don't, we're just going to go ahead and skip that. 4K output select. So basically what you can do here is you can record internally to the camera and to like a Shogun via the HDMI, the way we have it set up here. Or you could say, hey, when I hit the record button, just record or send it over HDMI and don't record it to the card as well. A few things to keep in mind when you use an external HDMI device like this. One is when you're in 1080, you don't have much to worry about because you'll be in standby mode or in record mode. They'll both work in terms of being able to see both displays on the back of the camera as well as your external display. It gets more complicated when you go to 4K. When you go to 4K, you'll be able to see both in standby mode, but when you hit record, you will lose the display on the camera. And then it gets a little bit more complicated when you go to proxy mode. The opposite happens when you're in 4K. You're going to lose the Shogun or external display, but you'll have it on the back of the camera. All right, USB connection. If this is grayed out, you probably have control with smartphone turned on. You'll have to go back, find it, turn it off so you can get to this location. Most times you'll never have to do anything with this. So if you take your camera and you use the USB cable to your computer, I'm on Windows, it'll negotiate, figure out what it needs to do, and I'll say, oh, I'm going to probably go to mass storage. And that's usually what pops up is mass storage. And which is good because this camera becomes a physical drive, at least in Windows 10. And you can find things quite easily. Some of these other items I've tried, it's harder to find where the files are. So I would start with mass storage if auto doesn't work. These other two, they don't even tell you what they really do in the manual. For instance, PC Remote talks about something about using imaging edge to control your product from the computer. I don't even know what imaging edge is. So auto, I think for the most part, for most of you, is going to work fine. USB LUN setting. If you are having problems with your USB, go ahead and try single. Multi's always worked well for me, but in the manual it says if you're having a problem with one, try the other one and see if it works better. USB power supply. I would definitely leave this on. That way you can power the camera via USB. Now if you have two power supplies and you're plugging them into the camera, I believe the first one that you plug into the camera is the one that is going to supply power to the camera. PC remote settings. This is photography only related because I believe this has to do when you're tethering the camera to a computer or a laptop. Does it save on the camera and the computer at the same? It's asking those type of questions. It has nothing to do with video. All right, language, very obvious. Hopefully your primary or secondary language is English. If not, you probably had a really tough time understanding what I've been saying the last couple hours. Date and time, we've already covered this. Area setting, that's basically your time zone. Copyright info. So if you turn this on, basically embeds the information that you're going to provide below into your still image, like a RAW or JPEG type of image. It's going to have that EXIF data or your copyright information embedded into that. Now for video, it really doesn't matter because, well, at least last time I looked in like Sony Catalyst, which does show you a lot of meta information. Unfortunately, it doesn't show any copyright information embedded into the video file. And if you upload it to YouTube anyway, it's going to get all lost. But the great thing about Sony Catalyst Browse is it actually shows you way more information than the sidecar file, the XML file that gets created with each movie file. Sony Catalyst Browse actually shows you ISO, shutter speed, sometimes even like white balance, which is great information to have if you need to recreate a shot. All right, format. We've already kind of talked about this before, but I would recommend that you format rather than delete your cards, and format your card before you leave in the morning to go for a shoot. So basically, if you keep deleting and deleting and deleting, the chances of that card getting corrupt and having it to rebuild its database and maybe you losing information keeps going up. But if you reformat each time, you start kind of on a clean slate for each time that you shoot, which is a good thing. All right, file number, you have series and reset. When it comes to video files, they create, like the first one that you create is C001. And if you format your card each time, you don't have to hit reset here. It's always going to go back to 0. But if you wanted to and you're not in the habit of formatting, you come in here and hit reset if you needed to. Set file name. I've set this to A7iii, which is the name of this camera, which is great. And before you get too excited, this only is for images and it has nothing to do with video files, because if you create a video file, it's just going to start with C like 001, unfortunately. Record media settings. So right here, this first one, prioritize slot 1 and slot 2. This is different than what we did in the playback menu. The playback menu, we were setting what we wanted to play back from, slot 1 or slot 2. Here, we're setting what do we want to record to. I'm going to leave this in slot 1. I would normally just leave this always in slot 1. Just makes your brain think a lot easier when you're figuring this out, because this can get a little bit complicated. The next one is record mode. And basically standard, if you have nothing in slot 2, card 1 is going to fill up and then you're done. But if you had another card in slot 2, basically what's going to happen is nothing. Nothing's going to go to card 2. Unless you go down here to auto switch media and you turn this on, basically once you fill up card 1, it goes to card 2. So let me go ahead and demonstrate this. I ran a test earlier. So what happens about 51 seconds before the switchover happens between the two cards, it's going to start to blink right about there. You see how it blinks at the top right next to the slot number 1 indicator? 51 seconds later, I'm going to fast forward it here and I'm going to show you what happens. Keep watching at the very top where it's flashing 0 and where the card slot number 1, and watch right there. You see how it wrote to the card number 1? That's where the crossover happened. So let's go watch it again. So we're going from card 1 to card 2 now. But what's weird is when you look at it, you're like, well, why doesn't it say card 2 if it's recording on card 2? And that's kind of what I expected. I was like, wait, I was expecting it from 1 to 2, but it never did. And the reason I was moving my thumb in front of the lens when I was doing that test is I wanted to see if it skipped any frames. So what I did is I took those 2 video files, one from card 1, the first one, and then the second part of it in card 2, and they're both labeled C001. So they're both named exactly the same thing. I brought them in the NLE, smashed them up against each other, and then I played it to see, and I was actually talking at the time to see if there was any, I could hear or see any skip frames when I was moving my finger back and forth, and it didn't skip any frames, which is great. So you don't want to have that problem. Let's go ahead and turn this off right now, and then let's go up here to record mode and explain what each one of these is. So the first one is simultaneous stills. So you can see from the graphic down below, so slot 1 is going to record both stills and video, but slot 2 is going to duplicate the stills only. Then we move our way down, the opposite happens. We're going to duplicate the video. Moving our way down, basically now it's basically going to make a total duplicate from card 1, and card 2 will be identical. So it's a great way to back things up if you ever worried about a card failing, which doesn't happen that often. I think in the last 8 years, I've only had one card ever fail on me. These two are stills related, so I'll skip these. And then this last one is sort. So basically it says, hey, slot 1, you're going to have pictures, and slot 2, you're going to have all your movies. Now, if I were you, if you wanted to back things up I would do it like this, and I would leave this off and not turn it on, because that's just going to confuse things. And then in terms of slot 1, I'd always leave it in slot 1. Now you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, how does that work with the 30-minute time limit on these files? Well, it doesn't matter. If you are recording, let's say 15 minutes on slot 1 and it switches over, it'll record 15 minutes on the second card and stop. Select Rec folder. If it's grayed out, that means you have a nice mintly fresh formatted card, and that's why you don't see it. I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder, and when you do it, it just creates folders for you. And I'm going to go ahead and create another one. Boom, just created another one. So now I'm going to go back up to select Rec folder. This has only to do with stills. All your video files will never get stored in these new folders that you're creating. It's only stills related. The only reason I'm mentioning it is, let's say you select the first one, which is 100. So you set up your camera, do your time lapse, a whole bunch of images, you're done. You pick up your tripod, go to the next location. Well, then after you're done with that one, you'd go to here and go to 101, and then you go create another time lapse. And then when you bring it into post, all those time lapses are in different folders. And then you can just bring the folder into your NLE, and however you deal with your time lapses in your NLE, but it makes things a lot more cleaner and easy to find later on in post. All right, next up is folder name. This is totally photography related, but you could change it from date to standard form. In the video world, when we bring the card in, we have our own private folder called private. I don't know why the videos are more private than the still images, but that's what they call it in Sony land. So this has nothing to do with videos. Recover image database. Basically, what happens a lot of times if you're swapping cards with different cameras, even sometimes the same brand like Sony, but maybe it came from Canon or Panasonic and it ends up now into your card and you didn't format it, it might say something like, I don't know what's going on here, and it might actually come up, would you like to recover the image database? You basically just go in here, select your slot, and then it's going to check. It's going to go through and check, and if it finds any errors, it'll fix it. And a lot of times, it will actually fix errors and put things in the correct folders, I guess you could say. So if it ever comes up, don't be too afraid of it. It usually does a great job fixing things. Display media info. You could pick your slot, and basically it's going to say, hey, you can put up to 3,307 images on the 64 gig card, or you can do 1 hour and 14 minutes of Xavc at 4K. So version and setting reset we've already covered in a previous video. So this is the end of video B.